Yeah, yes, certainly can. The one thing I would say is that I didn't say this and I was asked to by Danny, make sure you're in full screen mode and make sure you've got the windows that Jay's showing available as big as is humanly possible, okay? Because there's a lot of information to fit on this screen, okay?
Yeah, sorry, so hence I've put this up quickly, Dave, is I just want to make sure if we get a feel from the participants whether they can see the screen before I continue.
If you can just put into the chat box, if any of you are like, I can't see that, it's rubbish, please make it bigger, or if you can cope with it. So we'll just give you guys just a minute, okay? So we're getting some okays, this is good. Yeah, we've had 2 okays. I mean, yeah, good, fine. Yeah, cool. Go for it, Jay. Yeah,
okay,
we're good.
Awesome.
All
Perfect.
yours, mate.
Morning, everyone, and welcome to yet another Checkpoint Masterclass. We do have a fair amount of content, so I'm kind of glad Dave's finished sooner than expected. I think I'm going to go straight into it because, like I said, there is a fair amount we need to get into. But before I do, start talking about some of the interesting stuff, what I'd like to do is really draw everyone's attention to probably the less interesting but equally important stuff, and that's the end of support information here. This time last year, 80 or 8010, you know, I don't think anyone's on 80. Most people would have been on 8010. They had the end of support date as May 2021. This was this time last year. However, with the global pandemic and the challenges the businesses have had with doing upgrades, Checkpoint decided to push this back or extend it to Jan 2022. So as you can gather, that's still not that far away. It is just almost a month. So if you're still on this, please start planning your upgrades. The reason there's an asterisk beside that is not all software had their support extended. So CloudGuard Network Security Gateways and CloudGuard Network Security Management, they still had the end of support date in May 2021. If you are planning to do upgrades, if you're still on this version and you're planning to do upgrades, obviously don't go to 8020 or 8030. In fact, I'd probably even say think about 81, because 81 is now the widely recommended version by Checkpoint. 8110's been out almost 6 months, as you can see, so I'd expect in probably a month or so, 8110 will probably become the de facto recommended version. Lastly,
Jay, sorry, just to interrupt you, you haven't got your camera on. I didn't know if you knew that.
Sorry. The way to hide this at the top, does everyone see this as well?
I think you went a big crime watch.
Yeah, and your camera's on, but it's gone a bit black for some reason. A bit weird.
Oh, okay. I think I know why. If people can bear with me, I think that's the apologies for that. Stuff doing it live. I think it's that. How about now?
Yeah, there we go. We can see you fine. All good.
Yeah. Or this better? Sorry, I can't see myself.
That's perfect. Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, cool. Fine. Sorry. Back to. So, what was that? So, if you are planning to upgrade, think about 81. The other thing I want to quickly mention is the 2012 appliances, by the way. These went end of engineering support in June 2020. What that means is any software that's been released past June 2020 will not be supported on these appliances, which means 81 and 8110. So these are the list of appliances. So again, please have a quick scan through. If there's anything in here that sticks out, if you're still running these appliances, bear in mind you've got about 6 months left before these appliances go end of support. As always, if you've got any issues or if you need help with doing upgrades or with hardware refreshes or licensing, we're here to help. So please reach out and speak to us. And with that, I think I will head to my Smart Console. So I think I'm going to start with one of the major functionalities released with R81. But before I get into that, let me give you a little bit of explanation around the why behind releasing this feature. Up until now, configuring and maintaining IPS, I say IPS, in fact, threat prevention, was a bit involved. You know, you had to research threats, you had to decide which protections or settings to enable, which ones to disable. If you had threat emulation or threat extraction, there was file handling that you had to think about. All of this takes research, it takes a little bit of time. You have to make certain configuration changes, push a policy. Most customers, unfortunately, haven't got the time or the manpower to keep up with tweaking and doing watering and feeding the threat prevention policies. And as a result, we end up with security gaps or frustrations. So to address that specific challenge, what Check Point have done with 81 is they've introduced the autonomous threat prevention system. With that, if I go quickly into the gateway, so obviously, if you're only going to be able to see what I'm showing you if your management server and gateway are on 81. And by that, I mean this section here, tab, which used to be called threat prevention, is now showing up as custom threat prevention because we now have the ability to choose autonomous threat prevention, right? And if you've been using, say, IPS, antibot, so forth, it will, if you do an upgrade, it will show up as custom threat prevention. What you can do at this point is choose autonomous threat prevention. As soon as you do that, it takes away your ability to select one of those blades. It will fetch the information off of user center based on your contracts, and it will enable relevant blades that you've got the licenses for. Once you've done that, if you head to your security policies and autonomous policy, you can now see it. I mean, as cliched as it is, and this is not really marketing, it really is a one-click setting. If you look at it, I mean, literally all you have, if you go to autonomous policy, is the ability to select one of these 5 predefined settings in here. Or sorry, profiles, shall I say. If you click on the Help Me Decide, it will show you these side by side, gives you a brief explanation. And what Check Point are doing basically is taking away the pain of configuring all of the settings for all of these different, technologies or software blades, put it that way, based on the function of that specific firewall. So say, for example, your firewall is protecting your cloud or data center, and it's only looking at protecting east-west traffic. You can select the cloud data center profile, and you can see it's only applying server protections. It's not going to bother with client protections. It will not do sanitization, which, by the way, if you're not familiar, that's the threat extraction blade, which effectively takes away any active content from like your document and PDF files. So if files are traversing internal to internal, there's no reason to do that. So it will take away that ability. In the same way, if it's perimeter, if files are coming in, then yes, obviously we want to do sanitization. And if it's guest, there's no point dropping traffic because all we want to do is detect and alert if there's any malicious activity going in there. So you can see, and as soon as you select, say for example, you selected the perimeter profile, Check Point will go away and enable all of these profiles in terms of, profiles, all of these software blades, all of these technologies based on that specific profile. So it's sandboxing, which is your threat emulation, your sanitization, which is threat extraction, antibot, IPS, AV, all of this will be pre-configured. Now, it's not, you don't have to deploy this to your entire network in one go. What you can do is, if I expand the deployment dashboard, what you can do is you can choose, say, for example, I'll pick my DevNet. I could say, do you know what, traffic to from DevNet, don't apply any protections. For my demo LAN, do detect only, and everything else will be according to the profile. So it's not really all or nothing. So that's autonomous threat prevention. The big question is, should you switch to using it instead of using the custom threat prevention policy? And the answer to that is it kind of depends. But I'll give you a few examples to think about. If you think about, say, new file type support, okay? When Checkpoint release, say Checkpoint release support for a new file type, when it comes to AV, threat emulation, threat extraction, if you're not using autonomous threat prevention, you'd need to know about it. That Checkpoint have released support for that specific file type. You would need to know what the best practice is for such file types. So, should you clean it? Should you drop that file? Should you emulate that file? You would need to then go and configure your threat emulation, threat extraction, and AV policies of the profile, check a few boxes, push a policy. With threat prevention, with autonomous threat prevention, all of that is taken care of automatically. Another really important thing to think about, or as an example, is say there's Checkpoint threat research to detect an attack in the wild, which includes, say, a lateral movement within your internal network using a specific file type that uses SIFT, for example. Pre-autonomous threat prevention, you would need to know about that attack in real time. You would need to know, what file type, how it's traversing, what protocol that file is using to traverse through your network. You then need to adjust your profile to be able to block that file on that specific protocol. You would need to go within AV and make changes for that specific file type, and you would need to push a policy. Autonomous threat prevention, all of that's taken care of in the background for you. So, like I said, you can almost see, if you switch to autonomous threat prevention, it gives you that almost zero maintenance, but at the same time provides you with that continuous up-to-date threat protection for your gateways. So if you want to just let Checkpoint deal with it, go with that. If on the other hand, you have the manpower and you would very much like to have that granular control over the threat prevention policies, then go with the custom policy. Because don't forget, even that is really powerful. Obviously, it doesn't have the autonomous function built in, but it's really, really granular. And Checkpoint have made loads and loads of changes since R80 with threat prevention policy. Don't forget, you can modify the policy. And if I go to take IPS as an example, you can very much decide which protections you want the profile to turn on or disable based on specific category types. You've been able to do that for many years now. I've enabled these two columns, but not many people are aware that you have source and destination columns available within your threat prevention profile, because by default, these are not visible, right? All you see is a protected scope, which is any, and most people just leave it as default. What you can do, or you've been able to do for a while, is you can have source destination. Where this becomes useful is you can have different threat prevention profiles based on different traffic flows. So for example, you can have, say, a strict profile, which is only doing server-based protection for source of external to destination of DMZ. You can have another rule here, which is basically, say, a more optimized, right? Optimized profile for anything which is inside going out. So you've been able to do that for many, many years. So fair amount of control and fair amount of granularity that you can do with the custom threat prevention. So like I said, if you want to be completely hands-off, and let Checkpoint configure threat prevention, go with the autonomous threat prevention policy, because it really is the way forward. Because we've seen this over the years, many years. Customers simply haven't got the time to keep up with this. If you're one of the few who do have the time and the manpower to be able to deal with this, go with the custom threat prevention policy. By the way, if you do switch from, say, custom threat prevention to autonomous threat prevention, the only thing it will carry across is your global exceptions. Okay, so if you did create global exceptions around, say, certain traffic to certain destination, for example, you didn't want to apply either threat prevention in its entirety or specific protections. If you've done that already, all of that will be transferred across, so you're not going to lose that. Also worth bearing in mind, a couple of points is this is not an additional license. This is just a functionality that you can choose. It's also not all encompassing, so you don't have to apply this to all of your gateways. So you can still have a mix and match. So you can have one gateway that's using autonomous threat prevention, and you can have another gateway that's still using custom threat prevention policies. So it is a bit mix and match. You can do mix and match. So that's autonomous threat prevention policy. As you can gather, really big step in easing the management of threat prevention policy. And that's out now with 81 and above, and obviously you need both the gateway and the management server on 81. So with that, if no one's got any questions or anything burning, I'd like to move on to the next functionality, which is, and I think this is probably one of the biggest performance improvement feature that Checkpoint have released in a fairly long time, and that's the accelerated access control policy. Typically, as you probably know, policy installation can take anywhere between a minute to a few minutes, right? Depends on a number of factors, number of objects, the size of the rule base, resource utilization of the management server, performance or utilization of the firewall, but generally a few minutes. With 81, what Checkpoint have done is they've introduced this, in my opinion, a much awaited feature that reduces dramatically the amount of time it takes to do policy installation for most common firewall changes. Okay, and it's not as simple as saying they do, and I've heard people say this, that it pushes delta changes. There's much more happening in the background, but I won't go into what's happening under the hood here, or I won't bore you with the graphs, which are, again, I have seen around policy installation time with so-and-so version was this, and now with 81 it's this. So instead of that, let's make a small typical firewall rule-based change. But rather than making this change through the usual way, I'm going to use the management CLI because it'll be much quicker. So all I'm doing here, you can see, is creating a couple of hosts, a network, and creating a rule. So if I hit enter, there we go. So that's created a few hosts, a network, and that new access rule there. Just confirm it's done that. Yep. So I've got that rule, so that object, and I can see my host as well. Now, before I push a policy, I'm going to take a slight tangent here because I think this is useful. The fact that it's I've just made these changes. R81, if you made loads of changes and you walk away from your change midway, as it happens, you get dragged into something more important, more pressing, and you come back a couple of hours later, how do you work out how many changes you've made and where did you leave off? Not many people know this. I mean, pre-R81, there was still a way to find this, and I'll quickly show you if you're not on 81. What you could do is you could go to Preferences, And at the bottom, there was this tiny little thing called Enable Session Pane. And if you do that, it would show you the session activity in terms of the unpublished changes that you've made as part of that specific session. So it's kind of there in a bit of a rudimentary fashion, I'd probably say, but it's not, in a much user-friendly, readable format. So with 81, what you now have, I think is this brilliant, is you have this tiny button here at the top called Show Session Changes. And if I click on that, it will go away and generate a really useful report, which shows me the changes that I've made midway through that session. So you can see 3 objects created and 1 new access control, no changes within threat prevention. If I keep scrolling down, I've got that rule, shows me the network, but look, it also tells me that network is used within that specific rule. And then if I keep scrolling down, I can see the hosts that are created. So you can see really, really useful feature here for in-session changes. And I'll come back to this later on as a dedicated session when I talk about change reports. I think this was useful because I was midway through making this change. Okay, so we make the change. If I install policy, click on publish and install. Another tiny tip here for those who aren't aware, if you're making changes or if you make changes and you're pushing a policy, try and pay attention to this little link here, because sometimes I've seen people don't realize that they might actually be pushing multiple changes from multiple sessions because there's other administrators who've made certain changes. They've published their change, but they haven't yet pushed a policy. So just be mindful of that. And you can, by the way, view their changes by clicking on that link, and it will show you in the old style of what those changes were. So if I hit install, and if I click on details here, that icon there tells me that the policy installation is being accelerated. And there you go. I haven't even finished my sentence. So that was under 10 seconds. That icon there tells me policy acceleration is enabled. And there are instances where policy acceleration might not be enabled. And there are a few points to consider here. If, for example, you're pushing a policy that's different to the one that already installed on the gateway, if you've just done a revert snapshot of the gateway and you're pushing a policy, if you make certain local changes to the management server, and you say you've modified files within fwdir/lib, and you make changes. But also, I have seen in my own lab environment, certain things where if you're making certain types of changes, I haven't quite narrowed it down, but if you make certain changes to access roles, and I think that's because I also have Azure AD enabled. So I don't know if it's the act of it pulling in information down, because there's 2 elements, there's the management server and the gateway. In certain of those instances, it doesn't do accelerated policy install. But like I said, majority of the common firewall changes that we do on a day-to-day basis, all of that is accelerated. So I think another major improvement with 81. Another thing, whilst I'm talking about policy installation, is to bear in mind you now also have the ability to have concurrent policy pushes. And by that, what I mean is you could be logged into your smart console, you could be pushing policy to, say, your corporate gateways, and at the same time, you could be pushing policy, that same administrator could be pushing policies to your branch office gateways, which is a different policy. Or you could have multiple firewall administrators pushing different policies to different gateways. So that, again, is now a thing. And yeah, so policy installation, accelerated policy installation does require R81 on both the management server as well as the gateways. So bear that in mind. And with that, I'd like to move on assuming no one's got any questions. I'm not keeping an eye on the
we do have
Yeah.
one question that came up on that. Can all changes that may be automatically emailed through to an administrator, can they be pumped through?
Not yet. So I will come to this later on. That plus one of the other things which I'm going to talk about later were two features that I requested Checkpoint, specifically Checkpoint R&D, to incorporate when they first came out. Email is not there yet, but I am in conversations with them, and I think it will be available eventually.
Cool.
But I'll cover that, some of the other bits that you can do as a workaround those changes later on in the section.
Okay, and we've got another one. Would you get any of these benefits of upgrading Smart Center Server to R81 without the gateway being on 81?
So, so far, what I've covered is threat prevention, the autonomous threat prevention, and the accelerated access control policy. Neither of those will work if your gateway is not on 81. The change, the session change that I showed, that's a management feature. So if you at least upgrade the management service of 81, you can benefit from that.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Nothing else has appeared yet. So
Okay, cool.
Please don't be shy, everybody. It's good to start getting some coming in. It shows you're all paying attention and had enough coffee. So yeah, keep chipping them in, please.
Brilliant. Okay, so next up for me is, oh yes. So whilst we've seen plenty of changes and new features being introduced with the access control policy and threat prevention policy, you know, the fact that we've been able to use zones, and the fact that we've been able to use updatable objects, data center objects, access roles, you know, the list goes on. One feature within the whole Smart Console, or specifically Checkpoint Management Server, that's been pretty stagnant, has been the NAT rule base. You know, not many changes have happened when it comes to NAT rule base, you know, for as long as I can remember, until R81. You now finally have the ability to do hit count. So if I do a quick click on that, hit count, and refresh, there you go. So we now have the ability to do hit count. And what this means is finally you can see which NAT rules are redundant, so you can start tidying up your NAT rule base. The hit counts column is not enabled by default, so just make sure you right click at the top and just make sure you enable that column. Also, I think it's worth mentioning at this point is hit counts, not necessarily within the context of NAT rules, but if I talk about your general firewall policy rule base, hit counts are independent of whether your rule is being logged or not. Please bear that in mind. And that's really useful, because if you have, you know, plenty of rules that where you're not logging because of the amount of rubbish it will create in terms of your, you know, you don't want to be logging DNS allow stuff or certain such rules. If you want to see whether that rule is being hit, that hit count will still show up, because that's based on the statistics the gateway sends back to your Smart Console, nothing to do with your the logs on your management service, so bear that in mind. So as a best practice, we still recommend reviewing the hit count of your rules every couple of months if you can. And what you can do is if you hover your mouse over that, it tells you when was the first time the Smart Console saw a hit on that specific rule, and was the last time it saw a hit. So if you can see a rule that hasn't been hit for the last 2 months, even though it might have a million hit counts, you can start investigating that. If you think it's probably redundant, disable it for a couple of months and then come back to it. And if no one's still complaining, get rid of that rule. Just start using the hit counts as tidying up your rule base. And like I said, you can now start doing that with your NAT rules as well. Another feature, another really interesting feature from my perspective, I think with NAT rules, is you can now leverage some of the new object types that we've been using for a while within our normal access control policy. So things like domain objects, updatable objects, security zones, access roles, even data center objects. You can start importing them within your NAT rule. naturals. Now, I'm conscious that we've used naturals for so long with just IP addresses and network or network groups, to start thinking about what could I use these objects for. I think that will take a while to wrap our brains around that. But to give you a few examples, start you thinking about what you could possibly use these for, is think about NAT exhaustion. So hide NAT port exhaustion. If you are already hide netting a fair amount of traffic outbound behind a single IP address, and say you move to Exchange Online, and even you go to Office 365 for your productivity suite, Outlook on its own, I think, uses up at least 8 outbound connections per user. You then add on, if people are accessing files through SharePoint, using the Excel, Word, all that, that's those additional connections. You can possibly have port exhaustion. So what we can do there is the fact that we can now use updatable objects. If I create a new rule, a sample, is you can say from my, I don't know, I'll take demo LAN, to, rather than using our traditional objects, what you can do is going to import updatable objects, and you can import everything that's listed here now within your natural. Okay, so going back to the example of Office 365, so if I select that, or no, if I just select just that, for example, that now is all traffic from demo LAN to Office 365, and I'm going to say set the source to be, I think there you go, I've created a Office 365 hide NAT IP. Obviously it does it static. I'm going to change the NAT method to hide, and now all traffic leaving your gateway headed towards any of the Office 365 IP addresses will be hidden behind a different IP address to your normal internet browsing traffic. So really useful feature. Another thing to think about as well is what you can do, I mentioned this earlier briefly, is you also have the ability to import your data center objects. So if you have, say, a checkpoint firewall in Azure and AWS, rather than creating the networks and the objects manually, which you had to do before when it came to NAT, you can actually go to, so I'll pick AWS, I have a CloudGuard in AWS, so pick that, and I can import the object straight from here. And the beauty of that is when someone changes the IP address or does any updates to that specific object within AWS, I don't need to change or update that object manually just for the sake of my naturals, which is what we used to pre-81. That now is just there. And the fact that we're using CloudGuard controller to hook in to our clouds and update the objects within our management server dynamically, that change will happen within 20 seconds, 30 seconds, I think, is how frequently the management server is calling your cloud environments. So if someone changes the IP address 23.26, for example, that will happen pretty instantaneously. So again, really, really useful. You can even, by the way, do NAT based on zones rather than groups of network, because I know a lot of us will have a massive group with all of the networks inside it, and we will say from that group to certain destination hide behind this IP address. And as and when we change or add other networks, we have to go and add it to this group. Make sure your zones are defined correctly. So go to your firewalls, say internal interface, make sure the zone is set to internal, and then you can say the original source, rather than giving a network or a group, just use a zone. And the beauty of using zones in naturals is that natural can then apply to all gateways where you define the zones appropriately. So again, really, really useful feature with NAT count. So I think overall you can see it's a fair amount of really new, interesting, and probably say powerful features within that, hit counts, the ability to use updatable objects. And I think there's another one as well, where if you're investigating logs, for example, within your log viewer, and you can open a log card, you can actually navigate from that log to a specific natural Des link now, which again wasn't available before R81. So plenty of new updates for Nat. Again, these changes are 81 and above. So management server and gateway does need to be on 81. Right, any questions so far before I move on?
Yep, couple.
Yep.
So how do you reset hit counts?
Oh, there's a bit there. I believe you can right click, hang on. There is actually, Dan might be able to help, but I think there's a counter or a setting on the gateway that you can run a command on to reset the hit count.
You're right.
So you do that, but here at the moment, the time frame is what you see here, but you can do hit count resets on the gateway.
We'll take that one away. Yeah. And then, this is a good one. Is network to network one-to-one NAT supported? Now that's an old chestnut, that is. I can't remember the last time we tripped over that in production. But I can remember the last time I tripped over it in production, and it was for a business that was supporting a mobile solution provider, is all I can say. So like 10.0.0.24 to 192.168.124, and then 1-to-1, 2-to-2, 3-to-3. It can be done, can't it? But it's not in the GUI, I don't think. Isn't it a command line based thing, or is it taken out?
And again, yeah, I think this is one of the things that I'm sure one of the consultants will be able to answer in a heartbeat. So I think if we take that away as well.
Yeah,
please.
We'll take that away. We can. Don't forget, guys. We'll tackle these between ourselves in the break. A couple of others.
Yeah.
Another one-to-one NAT question again. So there's a few questions around that. We'll follow those up separately. Does the gateway have to be CloudGuard to use CloudGuard controller objects in the policy? The manager allows you to add CloudGuard controller objects to a policy and push to on-prem, but it doesn't seem to work for us.
No, you should be able to use those objects on your gateway as well, because effectively all it is a table that the gateway holds, which is IP address to that object mapping. So my understanding is that should work on a gateway that's not a CloudGuard gateway.
Might there be a gateway version limitation depending on which gateway version they're running?
But again, we'll dig that up for you properly. Okay,
and then they're ticking through now. We'll deal with the one-to-one NATs, many-to-one NAT in VPN. Should be doable. In fact, I know that's doable. We've done that before. Is there any advantage to move to Smart One for the management pane of your on-prem gateways over upgrading your local management server to R81?
Sorry, say that again.
Is there, Stephen, I might need you to chip in and just explain that one a little bit more. Is there any advantage to move to Smart One for the management pane of your on-prem gateways over upgrading your local management server to R81?
When you say moving to Smart One, do you mean Smart One in the cloud?
I guess that's what he's saying.
That might be.
Yeah. Yes, there we go. We got a yes.
Yeah, so I mean, that's entirely a business's choice. I don't think there's a lack of functionality that I'm aware of between on-prem and cloud. But obviously, with cloud management server being in cloud, that's a business decision whether you want to do that. But I don't think there's a lack of functionality between the two. There's other challenges with moving to the cloud, and there's certain things that you need to think about. But that's an entirely different conversation.
Cool. Okay. All right, the questions have dried up for the minute. You can carry on.
Perfect. Awesome. So I briefly mentioned earlier about how you can view changes in your current session before you've even published them. So, and I know there was a question about email stuff. So pre-R81, if you wanted to view the changes for any specific session, say for example, you would go to Management Settings and Sessions, and in here you go to Revisions and click on the top one, for example, is the change that we did recently. Click on Audit Logs, and you'd have the visibility of all of the changes that you've done as part of that session, right? So again, you'd have to click through each one, view what the changes were, the details, and all of this information was there. So information's there, but not in the most presentable or reportable format. From 81, what Checkpoint did is the first iteration of the change report that came. So what I'm showing you now, this is for published changes. If you want to view changes for a current session, that's from within security policy and the section, the button that I showed you earlier. But looking at published changes, you select the one that you want to view, go to actions, changes, and you compare selected with previous list. Obviously, you can't do with the current session because we haven't made any changes at the moment. So if I click on that, and it will do exactly the same. So it will generate a change report, which will obviously be similar to the previous one because it's exactly the same changes. But again, you can see it tells you the policy that we make change to. It was access control objects, not threat prevention changes. The rule that we created, the object, again, the rule that the object is being used in, and the other two objects which I haven't used any of the rule base. So coming back to that question about can we email? No, we can't. But like I said, when this first came out in 81, we didn't even have the ability to print. And so 2 points that I've raised, and I'm sure lots of other people have raised with Checkpoint, is the ability to print and be able to email this. And to be honest, have some form of automation here. So as soon as a change is published, allow administrators to email changes. That would be brilliant. I'm sure that will come eventually. But until then, what I suggest is print this change to PDF and file it away for your audit, compliance, whatever stuff you want to use this for. But the other important thing that I'd like to flag is what you can do is you can use this feature for enforcing the full right principle. Because if you think about it, what you can do is you can create a permissions profile where you give, say, for example, a change engineer the ability to make the changes to your smart console dashboard, whatever you want to call it, in terms of creating objects, creating rules, all of that stuff, but take away the ability for that individual or that profile to push a policy to your firewall or, for that matter, threat prevention policy. What you can then do as a process is get that individual to print the changes to PDF, send it to the firewall administrator. The firewall administrator can review the changes they've done, and if they're happy, they can then push a policy. And it's worth pointing this out because I know not many people, unfortunately, this is one of my bugbears, is I still see people with full read-write or even worse, super user permissions profile, everyone accessing dashboard when they shouldn't really be. Delegated administration has been about for years now, since R80 came out. So please try and use them. So this example that I just gave you about using, kind of a change engineer kind of a profile where the person can make changes, but they can't push policy. If you want to do something along these lines, what I'd recommend is start with the read-write all. So clone that policy. Clone that profile, and rather than moving away and doing, because everything will be grayed out, make sure you switch to customize, and then all you do is go to access control and take away their ability to install a policy. Yeah, and do the same with threat prevention policy. Let's do that, and this way, that change engineer, when he logs in, can do everything, just won't be able to see the install policy button here. Also, whilst I'm on this page, profiles, you can do loads and loads of stuff here. You can create another profile for, say, your information security team, where you give them the ability to install threat prevention policies if you want to make all of these changes, but take away all of this ability so they can't meddle with the firewall side of things, and so forth. So that's change report, which, like I said, is out with 81, and the ability to do print is from 81.10. However, I'm also aware that Checkpoint tend to update Smart Console as an entity on its own. To give you an example, if I go back to my slides, this is a screenshot of my very own Smart Console, and you can see Checkpoint tend to update the Smart Console automatically. So certain features within Smart Console will be updated without you even having to do anything, without you even having to update or download a new instance of Smart Console, or even updating the management server. That it just happens in the background. It's just something to be aware of as well. So that's change report. You don't necessarily need the gateway to be on the newer versions. This is more a management feature. And like I said, if you get to the point where you have the print function, you can start filing over these changes for audit purposes or enforce that 4i principle. Okay, so moving on.
Just a couple of quick questions,
yeah,
Jay, that came in while we were going through there. Just trivial one. How long are the audit logs kept for?
Audit logs, I think, permanent. Everything else tends to be purged automatically, but I think the audit logs are, unless the firewall the management server starts running out of disk space, then the settings that you would have configured in there of how much data to keep, I think that might kick in. But from experience, it might delete your standard logs, but I don't think it deletes your audit logs. On that point as well, quickly, Dave, I'll touch on. If you've seen within actions, purge, be very careful. Obviously, you don't want to keep loads and loads of revisions. You want to try and purge them. But if you do purge, say, for example, that point, if you purge there, everything from that point older will be removed from your database in terms of the audit logs. So just be mindful of that.
Okay. We had a question about updatable objects and how often they're updated, which Dan's answered in the chat.
Cool.
Quick, just in terms of the agenda, are you going to be looking at, I think the answer to this is no, so we might take this offline, app control policies, where one of the guys on there, Kevin, has got an issue with an app that is an SSL 443 app. He's blocking it further down and it's ticking through. I don't think we're going into app control in any detail, are we? So we'll probably pick that up as a separate one.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Okay, no, that's it for now.
Okay, awesome. So this, again, yet another interesting one. Finally, some great news for Mac users who have been RDPing to their Windows machine to manage their firewalls. With R81, so sorry, not R81, Jumbo Hotfix Take 10 of R81, Checkpoint released the first iteration of Web Smart Console. Okay, so it didn't come out with the initial version of 81. It came out with the Jumbo Hotfix Take 10 of 81. They came out with the first version of the Web Smart Console. Initially, when they came out, it was a read-only, right? So you had read-only access and only to certain elements within Smart Console. It was still a good start. Checkpoint did commit at that point to say they will start rolling out new features and functionality within the Web Smart Console element gradually, and in fact they will keep doing that without the customer having to upgrade or update their management server, and they have been following on through that. The beauty of this, by the way, is the Web Smart Console element runs on a Docker container on your management server, so it's kind of independent of the rest of the code. So Checkpoint have, and I have seen this firsthand, and I'll show you this in a second. So I'm going to log in here as a different administrator. So let's log in as myself quickly. So I have seen this where when I, a few weeks ago, when I logged in, I had the ability to view a lot of the stuff through Web Smart Console, but I didn't have the ability to, publish or discard. and 81.10, and there's a specific jumbo, but I think 81.10 onwards, they brought about the ability to do publish and discard. So it was kind of a read-write access. There's still certain things that are missing. So, for example, now I can make changes. So, for example, if I go here, I just type test, I can now write. If I go to my management server here and go to my policy, I can see that rule is locked. And if I go here, I can see the other administrator through the Smart Console is Jay. If I head back here, I can publish or discard. If I publish this, for example, that test should update. There you go, it's update. And you can, as you can see, you can have multiple administrators accessing your management server through different Smart Consoles simultaneously. That's not a problem. Going back to the Smart Console, sorry, I missed this. I should have said to access this, but hopefully you've seen this, is you simply go to the IP of your management server /Smart Console. So I was saying, like, as I was saying earlier, they have been updating the Web Smart Console functionality in the backend without me even having to do anything. Like I said, a few weeks ago, I had the ability to publish discard. Install policy wasn't there. And only last week, I was just doing one of these dry runs and I was making sure everything's working. And lo and behold, I now have the ability to do an install policy. So again, this is really, really useful for most common changes that you're doing. And the reason I say most common changes is not everything is still available here. But if you're creating rules, adding, editing objects, all of that's still here. Certain things, so for example, you can view the threat prevention policy, but I can't edit the profile. I can view the autonomous policy. With autonomous policy, I can do deployment dashboard updates here. So that seems to be possible, but not necessarily within custom policy. So like I said, really, really useful. They are making changes every now and then, ever so often. So if you are on 81.10 and above, you can have read write and have the ability to install policies as well. Another use case, by the way, and this is an interesting one, and I think this is where it's really powerful, is, oh, by the way, if you want to log out, it's this top left corner. And if you click log out there, I'm now going to log in as Ed to explain what I mean. So I've created a permissions profile for Ed, which means he cannot view any of the policies, okay? And he's got read access to all of the objects. Where the Web Smart Console is really useful, in my opinion, as well, this is another use case, is the log view. Because, say, for example, if you have, a support team, or you have NOC or SOC team, and they're constantly investigating stuff and going through logs, rather than giving them access to Smart Console, where, we do have the logs view there as well, and we've got the logs. So, say, for example, if I do that, you've got logs here, right? But the beauty where this is really, really useful is you've got the statistics pane on the left, and you've got the log card on the right. If I could, I could use this to say, you know what, I just want to look at my firewall logs, and I only want to look at drop. And you can see all of this updates dynamically, and I can keep going. Show me drops from that specific IP address to that specific destination, specific service. You can keep going, and you don't have to double click on log entry as you have to do with the Smart Console to view log entry, the log card. By me clicking on any one of these, I can see the log card populate instantaneously on the right. So really, really useful for if you have teams or individuals that you only want them access to the logs. So there you go. That's Web Smart Console now out with 81 jumbo hotfix 10 and above. And if you're on 81.10, gives you the ability to do read-write changes. And as you can now see, I can install policies as well with a Web Smart Console. So before I move on, any questions on that?
Not specifically.
Okay.
We have had a question, which I don't know if you want to weave in, around recommended approaches for granting access to Office 365 and Teams, i.e. app control, dynamic objects, SSL inspection, etc., etc. I don't know if that's something we want to just kind of weave in or take offline. It's up to you. That's kind of that's a subject in its own right, really, isn't it?
The thing is, we if you remember, Dave, we covered this in detail a couple of years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I absolutely can. I'm just conscious of time. I've got 15 minutes and a few other things. So
let's take that one potentially as an offline. Yeah,
offline, or if we, if I finish before 11:15, then I can cover that off.
Yeah, no worries.
Cool. So I'm just getting ready for the next one. So the other really interesting feature that Checkpoint have released is with 81 is a feature called Data Center Query Object. Now, hopefully, people are aware that Cloud Guard Controller has been around for many years now, where you can use to import objects from your cloud environment into your objects database on your management server, rather than having to create them manually. The benefit of that, as I showed within the natural, was you are importing the objects dynamically. The objects get updated dynamically as and when changes happen within the cloud environment. All of that's handled through the API between the management server and the cloud. If you have multi-cloud environments, so say, for example, you have Cloud Guard deployment in AWS, Cloud Guard deployment in Azure, and I'll use a specific use case so it's better for me to explain. Say you want your on-prem Terraform server to have access to all R&D instances, irrespective of what cloud they're in. Okay, what you can do, because we've got Cloud Guard Controller, is let me take that rule. So let's say demo lab, right? If I want that network to have access to all R&D instances, I can either import those R&D instances as objects, or I can do a little bit clever, which is I can have a process in place or a procedure in place where I say to my dev team or the DevOps team, or the infrastructure team, to say, when you're deploying the R&D instances in the cloud, can you please make sure that you tag them with the tag department equals R&D? And what that allows us to do is I can go to add, import, data center. I'll take AWS first. So rather than, once that shows up, so there you go. So rather than import this instance, which I know is tagged as department equals R&D, but for the purposes of my lab, I've only got one instance, right? If I have 100 instances, rather than importing 100 objects, what I could do is import just the tag, right? So I've done that. So I've imported a tag called R&D from my AWS cloud, and I can then do exactly the same for my Azure environment. So I can go to Azure, and rather than importing that object there, that virtual machine, which has a tag department equals R&D, if I just import that tag, and there you go, right? So this is how you do it pre-R81. If you have a common attribute across multiple cloud deployments where you have cloud guards, you would still need to import each and every individual one. What you can do with 81 and above is, rather than do this, you can create something called a data center query. So let me go to cloud, data center queries. I already have a data center query here, so I'll open that. Well, actually, let me just create a new one so you can see what happens if I do a new. Call it R&D tag. Oh, that's exactly what I've called that. I'm going to call S. So create a query, and I'm going to say that query all data centers. And I'll explain where this is useful because I'm not being specific to any data center. I'm saying all data centers. And then I'm going to create a query rule based on tag. So I'm going to say tag is department, and the value is R&D. Okay. Once I've done that, if I click the preview query icon, you will see it's now gone away, queried those two cloud data centers, and it's come back for my AWS lab. It said, yep, I found one instance with the IP address, and in my Azure, it's found one instance that has a tag R&D equals data center. So you can see it allows you to kind of automate and do things in a much better and optimized manner rather than having to import stuff individually from those data centers. Where this is even more useful is you can create these data center queries, and you can create your rules, say, for example, your AWS data center. But if rather than using the objects from the data center, if you use a query, the beauty of that is when you start deploying workloads, say in Azure, where you haven't yet started deploying workloads. As soon as you start deploying workloads in Azure and you make sure that your tags match to what they should be across the cloud, because using a query, those rules will automatically apply to that data center when you deploy the Cloud Guard Firewall. There's no policy creation, so to speak, that you need to do for that specific cloud data center. Obviously, the only thing you'll need to do is make sure Cloud Guard Controller is configured to hook in with that specific data center. So really, really useful, out now with 81 and above. Okay, so that's data center query object available with 81. Any questions on that before I move on?
No, feel free to move on.
Cool, perfect. So talking about data centers, there's another interesting object that Checkpoint have released with 81 called generic data center object. This is an interesting one. So whilst we have these, data centers which is specific to Azure and AWS, what generic data center allows you to do, say it allows you to allow or deny access to from IP addresses that are defined in a file, a JSON file that's located on a web server. Okay, so to do that, what you do is if I go to data centers, and I have created a generic data center object. You can see that's not Azure or AWS object type. That's actually generic data center. So all you do is you point that object to a JSON file that could reside on an external web server for any purposes, or in this instance, which is what I'm doing here, is I've put this file on my local management server, which is why there's no IP address. It's just home admin, and I've changed the interval from 60 seconds for the purposes of testing to 10 seconds. So you create a file on the management server and you point the data center object to that file. If I go to my management server and if I cat that file, that's the structure of the file that you need to make sure that you create. I will list the SKs for a lot of these things that I'm talking about eventually in the slide deck, which will be sent around to you guys. There'll be more details in there. But that SK lists the structure of the data center, the generic data center JSON file. But effectively, what you're looking for is the version, description's optional. Then you have the object section, and you would have defined objects within these curly braces. So I've only got one object, as you can see, Cloudflare, and that is mandatory. So you have to come up with a unique ID or the identifier for each object. And if you're wondering how to do that, there's like websites where you can log on and you can generate on the fly unique identifiers. Obviously, I've got an incorrect IP address for Cloudflare, but that's purposes of this demo. And once I've created this file and I've populated it with the objects, obviously at the moment I've only put one object in, but you could have hundreds, thousands of objects here. And for each object, you would populate it with a list of IP addresses. Again, I think the SK list, I think you can go up to about 5,000 entries or something silly like that. You can define single IP addresses, you can define a range, you can define a subnet, you can define IPv6 addresses. Literally, you can define anything that you normally define within the objects database in terms of hosts or networks. Once you define this file, you create the generic data center object, you point to where that JSON file is, test connection, make sure it's connected. And once you've done that, in the same way we went and imported those objects or those tags from within AWS and Azure, you simply go to import data center, and you pick the generic data center object. And from there, you can import the Cloudflare object, which is the one that I've created. If I hover my mouse over that, you can see the IP address is 888. So on my this test machine, if I try and ping Cloudflare, it's not going to work. If I head back here to my management server, if I buy that file, no, didn't want to do that. Oh, there you go. So going to add the IP there and just make sure it's updated. Yep. So if I now head back to my management server, so remember the time, the interval, I've set it to 10 seconds. So any second now, if you keep an eye here, that IP address should have additional IP in there for 1.1.1.1. Any second would be good. There you go. You can see it's updated automatically. I didn't have to publish any changes. I didn't have to push policy. And if I now head back here, there you go, access is granted. So really useful feature. There's a couple of use cases where I can instantly see this is really beneficial. So say the first one is you have your firewall administrator who's responsible for managing the whole rule base, objects, all of that. But you have a DevOps team who want a much quicker turnaround time in terms of granting access to certain IP addresses and certain ranges within their lab. What you can do, and this is what I've done, is I've created a inline layer, and I've restricted it to specifically to their network, which is their DevNet. So all I'm saying is any traffic that arrives from that heading to that specific object, and then I've got rules underneath it. So the only thing I can give access to, let's say, the DevOps team lead is to that file, and he can make changes to that file as and so he wishes, and he can grant access to certain things automatically without having to bother the firewall administrator. The other use case as well is, obviously this is me allowing traffic to those specific IP addresses. We can also do the inverse. So you can have another object here called, say, a malicious IP addresses, and you can populate that object with all malicious IP addresses that your SOC team might let you know. So you can have a rule that uses that specific object, which is malicious IPs, and you can block or drop traffic from that specific IP address, or that list of IP addresses as and when the SOC team publishes. You can make this file available on a web server. You can put a front end to that file in terms of, like a nice form that populates that file. You can do some automation to update this file. One key point that I'd like to say is because the object is being modified or updated outside of the management server, any changes you make to that file, you're not going to find that within the audit logs. Okay, so you need a mechanism, to make sure only authorized personnel have access to edit that file, and you need to work out a way to have some form of audit tracking for that specific file. Okay, so that's generic data center object, again 81, and you do need 81 on the management server and the gateway. Any question before I move on to the last bit? I know we've reached 10:45, but shouldn't take more than a few minutes.
There are a couple of very, very little ones, but nothing that we can't address straight after we've given everybody a coffee break. So keep going.
Okay, cool. So the last thing I want to touch upon before we break is a new feature of functionality. I think it was really, really useful that came out with 81.10. Okay, so this is not 81, this is from 81.10, and that's the ability to what Check Point have done basically is they've changed the default behavior of the default cell values when you either create a new rule or you delete the last remaining value in a cell. So let me explain. So if I go here and do new rule below, you will see, rather than showing up as any drop, which is what happens normally, it comes up with none drop. I'm sure, I don't know about you guys, but we've seen a fair share of customers who've accidentally pushed an any drop rule, and we've had to get them out of that specific hole. So Check Point have changed this with 81.10. What this means is you can, by the way, also see there's a lovely icon there which tells you that this rule will never be matched. On a 81.10 gateway, that rule will never be matched. If it's pre-R81.10, that rule will not even be installed on the gateway. So basically, there's no detrimental effect by having this rule here. If you have upgraded, before I move on, the other thing, as I mentioned, is similarly, because this is the last object in the rule, if I delete that, rather than changing it to any, it will change it to none. Okay, so same behavior. If you've upgraded your management server, your gateway to, from whatever version to 81.10, the default behavior is still maintained as any. Okay, so I'd strongly recommend that if you do go to 81.10, make sure you change these to none, because really shouldn't have any in there, especially now that we have this feature available. The other thing I'd strongly recommend is change the behavior to be that rather than generate a warning, which is the default one, because what that does is it generates a warning. But if you've got multiple things happening, you push a policy, not that it's going to do any harm, but you will have a rule sat there not matching with none within one of the columns. So instead, if you do that, then it will just prevent you publishing the change, and it will be kind of in your face to say, right, I haven't published because you've got none. And you can then decide to change that that specific rule. So really strong feature. Again, I think this is really, really useful and available from 81.10 onwards. And I think that's me done, Dave. I think we can probably take that much needed coffee break now.
Amazing. Okay, everybody, we will wrap up at that point. I've got a 15-minute break in, so we'll be back just after 11 o'clock. Hard start at
Right, can everyone see my screen?
Yep, we can see an ESXi console and now a checkpoint console.
Perfect, thank you. So next up is Check Point's integration with Azure AD. So that's what we're going to be talking about for the next 30 odd minutes or so. First of all, I'm going to start with checkpoint support for Azure AD around identity awareness. This actually first came out, I believe, in 8040. I think it might have been with a jumbo, but it's now baked in, fully baked into R81. For those who've been doing identity awareness with Checkpoint, which has been around for a while now, will know, for on-prem Active Directory in terms of domain controllers, you've been able to pull in users and group information from AD, and then we've been able to use them within the access role for authorizing traffic in terms of your firewall rule base, and we've also been able to use those for access roles for remote access authentication and authorization. And for those who have worked with identity awareness with AD will know that it's based on WMI, right, where you register your gateway with the domain controller, and the domain controller will provide log on, log off information to the gateways. And that's how it knows, the user to IP address mapping, and then the gateway uses that information to authorize the traffic. What I'm about to show you in the next half an hour or so is the integration between Checkpoint and Azure AD. There is no on-prem AD in this lab, or AD sync tool, none of that. It's not hybrid, it's pure Azure AD, because I want to show you how you go about configuring checkpoints with pure play Azure AD, and some of the quirks and the challenges that you get, because it's different how you configure it and how it interacts and pulls that information from Azure AD. Okay, so I think it's really useful, hopefully, for anyone who's thinking about moving to Azure AD pure play of how this works. But first and foremost, to start off with, there's two separate mechanisms when it comes to working with Azure AD. For that, I'm going to head to my PowerPoint slide. Hopefully everyone can see my PowerPoint slide. So there's two separate mechanisms, one for authentication and one for authorization. Authentication, as we all know, is confirming the users are who they say they are. And in the case of authentication, the authentication flow will be run against Azure AD using Saml authentication, and also utilizing the captive portal functionality on the gateway. Okay, that's how authentication takes place. Authorization, which again gives users the permission to access the resource they should. For that part, we have to obviously use access roles within the firewall rule base, and for that, we need to use the management server to interact with Azure AD to pull in the user and the group information, and then populate the access role. Okay, so two separate mechanisms that we need to kind of think about. So hopefully, when I now go and explain how this works, and I'm showing the configuration, it hopefully makes sense. In terms of Saml authentication, again, I think it's really useful for you to kind of see this visually so that it all makes sense. The way authentication works is the user opens a browser to access a web resource through the gateway. At that point, the gateway will pop up a captive portal, which is your point step 2. And the captive portal will intercept this HTTP/HTTPS traffic, and will redirect the user, which is point 3, to the identity provider, which in our instance in this lab is Azure AD. At that point, Azure AD will either fetch the user's credentials from a browser cache, or if it's not found, it will prompt the user to authenticate within that window. Provided the user is authenticated, the identity provider, so Azure AD, will create a token, or I think it's called a Saml artifact file, which is effectively a tiny file that's kind of contains a unique identifier for that user. It sends it back to the user. The user will send that file back to the Checkpoint gateway, and at that point, the gateway is at a point to authenticate the user. There's a couple of things that happens that's I haven't shown here in the slide. So after point 5, what actually happens is the gateway exchanges that information with Azure AD, and Azure AD say, yep, that's definitely the token. The gateway says, okay, fine, that's all good. Azure AD will also send a Saml assertion file, which is again a tiny XML file, which contains more contextual information about that specific user, so their email address, the group they belong to, all of that information. And at that point, the gateway will allow the user to access the web resource that they originally requested as part of step 1. Okay, so that's how the Saml authentication flow or the mechanism happens through the gateway. The other thing to bear in mind, by the way, is for the authorization piece, like I've said, you have to use Azure AD. You have to use the management server to interact with Azure AD. And using that, what you do is you create, I'll go through this in a bit, you create an Azure AD object, and that object allows your management server to communicate with the Azure AD every few seconds to keep the user and group information up to date, so that when we go here, if I open that access role, for example, and I go to users, this information is me able to query my Azure AD to pull in those objects, because I have that Azure AD object from within the management server to Azure AD, right? So that's the authorization part that happens with the management server. So now, hopefully, that you all understand roughly how it works, I will now show you the actual configuration process. So I'm going to head to my Azure AD tenant. By the way, this is my dev tenant, which I have populated with few test users, as you can see. So I've got a few test users. So on here, on your Azure AD, what you do is you create an enterprise application. That's the first thing you need to do. I've created one called IDP. It's a custom application. Once you've created that application, you head to your, you find that application within your app registrations. Okay, so go to app registration, all applications, you find your application, and what you do is you copy the application or the client ID and the directory ID to Notepad. We then need to create something called a client secret, because effectively this is what the management server will use to authenticate itself against this API in Azure AD to pull in that information. So create a client secret. For those who've done this before will know, when you're creating a client secret, don't move away from that page until you've copied the value, because once you've copied the value, so if you haven't copied the value and move away and you come back, that's obscured. You can't get it back. You'll have to create a new one. So copy the client secret and copy the application ID and the directory ID. And at this point, head back to your management server and you create a new Azure AD object. And in there, you paste the application ID, the directory ID. Where is the application key? This is your client secret. Okay, so add that, test connection, make sure it's connected. And at this point, authorization part, the two mechanisms, the authorization part, that's done now. At this point, as I've shown you earlier, we now have the ability to import those users and groups from Azure AD. We now need to do the authentication part, which is Saml for the enterprise application. So for that, we head back to our Azure AD and go back to one other thing I probably should have mentioned here is on this section as well. What's it here? Oh, yes, sorry. The other thing is we need to make sure we provide API permissions as well. Sorry, missed that. So what you do effectively, you add a permission and you use the Microsoft Graph permissions to provide read all. Please ignore that read write. It shouldn't be a read write. That's me being too quick when I was adding these permissions. It's actually device read all, group read all, and user read all. You just need read all. You don't need read write for that, because this is how the management server will actually be allowed to query that. So it's all read all permissions. So that's within API permissions. So once we've done that, so now for the Saml part. So we go to the enterprise application, and within the enterprise application, we head to single sign-on, and we enable single sign-on. Now, because I've already configured mine, because this would have taken far too long if I was doing this live. If you are creating this from scratch, this would all be empty. Okay, so what you do is you go to edit, where it says basic Saml configuration. That field there and that field there will be empty by default. To populate this, we head back to our management server, and we create something called identity provider, which is new with R81 and onward. So I've created an identity provider here called IDP. However, another point to bear in mind, if you haven't yet enabled identity awareness on the gateway, you need to go and do that first. Because if you don't, you can see when you create a identity provider to use Saml, it asks you which service this is tied to. So because in this instance, we are using it for identity awareness, I have to select identity awareness. And if you haven't enabled identity awareness on your gateway, this won't show up. So make sure, and to be honest, you don't even have to go through the wizard. So to explain what I'm saying, is all you need to do is if you head to your gateway, enable identity awareness as a tick box, you get the wizard that asks you to go through that, cancel that, but leave that in, and you head to identity awareness, and all you do is make sure browser-based authentication is turned on at this point, okay, for us to configure the IDP. So within IDP here, this object I've created, as soon as I change or select the service as identity awareness, it will populate the identifier entity ID and the reply URL with the gateway's information, and this is specific to identity awareness. So once you've done this for identity awareness, please then don't go and change it for Remote Access VPN. For example, if you want to do Saml authentication for Remote Access VPN, create a new identity provider for Remote Access VPN, because otherwise this won't tie with what you're populating within Azure AD. So copy these two from here, head to your Saml configuration, paste them on here, save that setting so it's populated accordingly. A couple of other things you need to do is you make sure your attributes and claims change the unique user identifier to be, by default, it's user.user principal name. The recommendation from Checkpoint is to change it to local user principal name. I think this is to do with if you've got like B2B users or guest users within your Azure AD, rather than their information being passed across, at which point it won't work. It actually provides the information that's within your tenant of Azure AD for that specific user. So change that. And then within users and group, make sure that you assign the group that's going to be utilizing or being authenticated against this enterprise application. Okay. Once you've done these two things, you can head back to single sign-on, and you're ready to download the Federation Metadata XML. Okay. Once you download that XML file, you go to your management server here and you import that file. Okay. As soon as you import that file, it will import things about Federation Trust that's used to create the trust, token signing certificates, all of the stuff that Azure and Checkpoint need to be able to trust one another. Once that's done, at this point, we are done with the Azure side of the configuration. Okay. At this point, head to your gateway and go to identity awareness, expand that. And in here, where we enable browser-based authentication, go to settings. The first thing we want to do is within authentication settings, we want to make sure that we're pointing identity awareness to the identity provider that we've just created, which is IDP. So select that. And then a couple of other bits that you need to do is make sure you're pointing to the main URL in terms of the portal access. I would strongly recommend that you, instead of having the IP address /connect, you use a fully qualified domain name. Reason being, if you do that, you can then generate a publicly signed certificate for that domain, and you can import it. So when users are going through a captive portal, they don't get those certificate errors. So do those couple of bits, and then also make sure that you allow the portal to be accessible through all of these interfaces. So you can do captive portal or identity authentication across all of your interfaces. Once you've done those things and we've done the authentication settings, that's it. We are now ready to start utilizing this. So we've done Azure side of configuration, we've done the identity provider, we've done the gateway, we've enabled the Azure AD object. So at this point, we would, here I have a rule which says internet browsing for my Azure AD users, where I have got my I've got a couple of users here individually. You can see I've imported them from Azure. And I'm saying, I have this internet browsing inline layer. Now, at this point, the first thing that came to mind was, so I've configured everything, but how is the gateway actually going to create that map of user to IP information? Because unlike the traditional way of doing things with on-prem AD, where the gateway already has kind of a map of user to IP because of the the security events information from the domain controller that's passed across to the gateway for log on, log off events. In this instance, there isn't. And if you remember going back to my slide here, authentication, you have to use a URL. Sorry, the user needs to access a URL through the gateway for the gateway to pick up that request, so you can then do captive portal, right? So I sat there thinking, well, how do I know what URL the user is going to, and how do I then enforce that so that I can bring in captive portal? So after tinkering it out a bit, now I'm sure enterprises could come up with a specific URL that user goes through, and that goes through the gateway, and that's how captive portal pops up. For the purposes of my lab, what I have done is, if I go here, I have a VM. This VM is joined to Azure AD. Okay, Diego is one of the users within Azure AD. The VM is joined to Azure AD as well. But you can see at the moment, Windows doesn't have internet access. So what I've done is, before the internet browsing rule, I've created a rule which effectively says all users within the ones that I've defined within my access rule, any traffic from those users heading to Microsoft or Office 365 services, I want to pop up the captive portal. So if I show you what I've done here, so if I click on more, I've enabled the identity captive portal. I also created a custom application or custom site which points to the msftconnecttest.com/redirect. For those of you know, this is the one which Windows will automatically open a browser to go to this URL if it can't detect internet access, just in case there's a captive portal in between. So because I know the user is definitely going to go through that URL, because I have said to be able to access to any of the Microsoft Office 365 services, which a Windows client will try and access when you log on, because this is Azure AD. I'm forcing that. I'm using the Captive portal. So if I go back here, I'm just log in as Diego, and you will see what will happen is once it logs on, Windows will pick up that it doesn't have internet access, and it will automatically pop up a browser. There you go. This is happening automatically, and you can see it's taken itself to that redirect page. Again, this is why I said try and avoid self-signed certificate. And if I click on go to web page, you will see that's taken me to the Captive portal. And any second, I should see kind of a Microsoft logo. And it should then authenticate me against Azure AD. And typical being, oh, there you go. I was about to say typical of like live demos and stuff, but yeah, there you go. So you can see that's now gone to internet access. And to prove that this is working as I expect, if I head to my gateway and do PDP-NA, I can see all the details for Diego passed back from Azure AD. So this has all come back from Azure AD. So you can see the group that uses a member of and the group ID as well. Okay. And now that's been picked up, hopefully my policy for internet browsing, which blocks gambling. So if I head back here and I go to editect.com, that should be blocked. If I head back to here and go to logs, there you go. So you can see it's picked up the user and that traffic's now blocked. Okay, so this is all the things that you need to think about, configure if you want to do identity awareness with pure play Azure AD. Obviously, if you have kind of a hybrid and if you've got on-prem servers, you can do some form of identity sharing from them. Or if you've got other gateways that's pulling in that information, you can pull the user information from there. But in terms of authentication, if the gateway is relying purely on what's happening with Saml, you have to make sure that the web request for a specific URL is going through the web gateway for you to be able to use Captive portal. Okay, so that's Azure AD. Any questions while I make a change to move on to the next bit?
The only question we had, which I think we've answered kind of on the way through, Jay, was if you've already defined an enterprise app in Azure for CloudGuard Connect, can you use the same details to link to the on-prem? Or, and obviously there's more configuration work to be done, but you know,
no, I'd rather use a different application. Thing is, it literally takes 5 minutes to set it up. I'd rather use a different application because I think, to be honest, we might be able to, but I don't know how the Checkpoint Smart Console will react because when you create the IDP, you have to populate which Azure AD it's using. So you might be able to get away with it, but I don't think you can. But again, I'm more than happy if someone's interested to test this in my lab because this is a fully functional lab, which I can do anything I want to try and test. So please let us know. Yeah, it's absolutely fine.
Yeah, and then another question, same person from Stephen. Would using Azure AD be less problematic than AD query with local DCs? I mean, that's a tough question, isn't it? Because you're becoming dependent on cloud infrastructure when you move to Azure AD. Whereas if you've got AD query from an on-prem firewall against an on-prem gateway, you know, against on-prem AD, at least it's all local. So I don't think there's a simple answer to that, is there?
Also bear in mind, this is the key point, is if you're doing your sole authentication with Azure AD, you have to rely on Saml, which means you have to force users their first traffic through the web browser, which isn't a problem, but it's just you have to think about that.
Yeah,
you know, the gateway in the traditional format with AD query, where it pulls in that information from your domain controllers even before the traffic hits the gateway. That's not the case with Azure AD. I mean, literally, I built everything and I sat there banging my head against the wall trying to figure out how to know which URL the client will go to.
Yeah, okay. Understood. All right, that
Anything
is
else?
it for now. No, that's it for now.
Okay, cool. So that was Azure AD for identity awareness. The next thing I'd like to do is show you how to utilize single sign-on authentication for your remote access VPNs using Saml with Azure AD. So for those who've been watching, I've moved this VM now. This was behind the firewall. I've now moved it in front of the firewall. And now, so first things first, if I head back to here, there's one thing that I do need to highlight. So a few prerequisites when it comes to doing SAML authentication for remote access VPN is you need to be on those specific versions listed under the requirements section. So if you're an 81.10, Jumbo hotfix take 9 or higher, 81 take 42, 8040 take 114. Please don't do with what I did, which is not pay attention to the version of the endpoint client. I had everything configured. I spent a day trying to work out why it wasn't working. I was using a slightly older client. You need to make sure you're using E84.70 or above. Also, that SK, which I've listed at the top, is your friend because it's fairly detailed. There's a detailed PDF in there that explains and takes you through all of this configuration and setting that you need to do. There is a script that you need to download as well that you need to run on the management server. And what that does is it updates certain policy validation settings, which otherwise, if you don't install that script, that would give you like policy failed to validate error messages. And there's a couple of changes you need to do within the GUI DB edit as well. I think the reason this is a thing in terms of, be on this specific Jumbo hotfix and you have to download this script and do this GUI DB edit is, I think this was released post, those versions. So it's kind of a new thing. I suspect from, I don't know, 81.20 or something, this feature should be integrated. So you shouldn't need to download the script and GUI DB edit and all of that stuff. But it's there. It's fairly straightforward once you know what you're doing to follow. So yeah, just make sure about these requirements and bear that SK in mind. So first things first is we do need to create another identity source for using remote access VPNs, using SAML authentication with your remote access VPNs. Because as you've seen for the IDP that we created for identity awareness, it is locked down to a specific service. So we have to create another one. Also, I'll come to that. But the fact that we are using an external identity source, we have to use the external user profile. So this is where we do need to launch the dashboard to configure an external user profile. The likelihood is for anyone who's had Checkpoint for many, many years, the likelihood is that the generic style profile already exists. It needs to match to any. But if you haven't, or if you're in doubt, just make sure you load dashboard, and within the users tab, there's a section for external user profiles, which once this loads, I'll show you. So I go to users tab here. There is a generic star user profile. So there goes that external user profiles. This is the one. So all you need to make sure is that you have a generic star profile. If you haven't, just make sure you create that. And when you do create that, make sure you match all users, not match by domain. Okay. Once you've done that, save the changes. And then the next thing you need to do is make sure that your gateway, you've done the usual things on your gateway. So for example, make sure that it's ready for remote access VPN. So make sure it's VPN's enabled. But the key point, in the same way where I asked you to enable identity awareness, because otherwise, if you haven't enabled it, when we create the identity provider, it doesn't show up. in the same way, even though you've enabled IPsec VPN, make sure you make the gateway a member of the Remote Access VPN community. Okay, so do that and do the usual, which is make sure you've got the office mode configured, make sure visitor mode's enabled, and make sure your Saml portal settings points to this URL. Again, ideally, same rule as identity awareness. Please make sure you're using a fully qualified domain name with a proper publicly signed certificate to avoid those certificate errors. And once we've done that, I'll come back to some of the other bits. But at this point, we are ready to create our remote access IDP. So in the same way that we did with identity awareness, select gateway within the service, select remote access VPN. As soon as you select that, the identifier, so identity ID, and the reply URL will be populated. Copy those, have them ready, and you head back to our Azure AD. And what we're going to do is create another enterprise application. Now, whilst I was tinkering, you can see I've created another, which is IDP_RA. But what I then found is there is already one available through the marketplace called Checkpoint Remote Secure Access VPN. And the good thing about this, so if you do create a new application and you do Checkpoint and you select that one, a lot of the settings are pre-populated in there, but also it provides you a link to the detailed step-by-step guide from Microsoft on how to go about configuring single sign-on for remote access users with Azure AD, okay, which is quite handy. Again, I think a lot of the stuff that's on there is similar to the SK that I mentioned earlier, but you can use that. So anyway, so I've ended up using that as well. So with this one, we don't need to create the client secret that we did with identity awareness because we don't need to use Azure AD object here. So all you do is go to single sign-on, click on edit, and you copy those two elements that we copied from the identifier ID and the reply URL, and we paste them here. One tiny difference compared to identity awareness is it has a sign-on URL. This is the bit that you would point to the one that I said your gateway had the Saml portal. So ideally, I'd want this to be a fully qualified domain name / Saml VPN. Yeah. Once you've configured that, similar thing to before is go to permissions. Sorry, not here. Users and groups, and make sure you define the group that's going to be authenticating against this identity provider, so this enterprise application. And once you've done that, go back to single sign-on, download the federation metadata XML, and import that file here. Okay. Once you've done that, we've done the Azure side of things. Okay. You can now head back to the gateway and go to VPN clients. And this time around, we go to authentication. And what we do here is we basically add a new authentication scheme for the identity provider that we've just created. So effectively change this by default. I think it's set to username and password, change this to identity provider and point it to the one that we've just created, which is the Azure_VPN. And go to user directories and make sure you selected external user profiles, which is the one that we did around the generic star external user profile. Once you've done that, at this point, we are kind of ready to start doing remote access VPN with Saml authentication. Slight challenge, or shall I say a workaround or different way of doing things, is in the same way how in identity awareness we were going to Azure AD users, and we've got importing users or groups from Azure AD to be able to use with an access role. This, unfortunately, is not a thing with when it comes to authorizing remote access users. Okay, and I think the reason being, this is a fairly new functionality that, like I said earlier, was released as a add-on feature. So what you have to do, and I don't see this as a challenge or anything. I think it's more a workaround, or there's no lack of functionality. But what we do need to do, so if I find my Remote Access VPN, what you do need to do is you need to go and find the user group. So this is a group that I want authenticating against my gateway using Saml authentication. You need to find the object ID for that group. Copy the object ID, head to your smart console, and what you do is you create a local user group with the format, as you see, capital ext underscore ID underscore, you paste that object ID, okay? And then you use that group within this access role. So if we go to users, you can see it's that group, okay? So, and this is no different to how we used to do, I think, for anyone who's worked with Check Point long enough will know, this is similar to how we used to use radius group definitions. It'd be like rad underscore and then the group name when we had radius servers external to the checkpoint, and we were still using generic start profiles, quite similar to that. So I've got a group, access demo LAN, I've created the remote access rule. If I now head back to my VM, so this VM, same VM, but this is now in front of the firewall. I head to my VPN, I hit connect. That there is the reason why I'm saying use fully qualified domain name on your gateway and have a proper signed certificate. If you had, you wouldn't get any of these pop-ups, and all you get is this lovely screen that says you've been authenticated by an identity provider without you having to put in any credentials. Yeah, and if I then open my command prompt and ping something behind right, so that's the VPN working. If I head back here, just refresh my logs at the bottom. There you go. And again, as before, it still knows who the user is. It's just that you have to use the group object ID from Azure as opposed to the actual group name. My suspicion is that this will kind of merge in the next major release, whether that's 81.10 or I don't know. This will merge, so we should be able to then use the Azure AD objects rather than having to do this. But again, I don't see this as a problem personally. I think this is just there's no lack of functionality. It's just a different way of achieving that end goal. So that's single sign-on for your remote access users using Saml with your Check Point gateway. Okay. Any questions before I move on?
We had one that Giuseppe kind of answered regard to, is Saml a one-time thing, or is it every time they want internet access? I think, I mean,
it's a one-time thing. It grants it for 12 hours.
I was going to say until the session times out, doesn't it?
Yes.
And then, so basically, if identity awareness knows who they are, it lets them through. If it doesn't, it'll ask them to reprompt.
Yeah, it's 12 hours. The token from Azure, and by the way, that's an Azure thing. I think Azure gives that token for 12 hours, and Gateway will cache it for 12 hours.
There you go. Okay, so, and that is the only question we have outstanding right now.
Okay, cool, perfect. So now that I've covered single sign-on authentication with Azure AD, let's take this a step further. If you have InTune as part of your E5 or E3 enterprise mobility and security license, you can even perform compliance checks on your endpoint to check if a client is compliant and only if it's compliant, allow them access to your Remote Access VPN. So to do that, what I have done is within my dev Azure AD environment, I have enabled InTune, so Endpoint Manager. And in here, all I've done, so I head to Endpoint Security. I have created a compliance policy called Demo, which I'll click on. And I go to Properties. It's fairly simple, nothing too complex. I'm requiring Firewall, AV, and Defender anti-malware. And I've assigned the compliance policy to the demo compliance group, which is the one that those users and those VMs are assigned to, the VMs that are assigned to that group. So I've got two groups, a user group and a machine group. And then I have created a conditional access policy as well. So if I had a conditional access policy, I've got a policy called corporate access, wherein I am limiting it to specifically that compliance group. And I'm also saying conditional access is only required for the remote access enterprise application that we created for authentication remote access users, nothing else. And finally, all I'm doing is basically saying grant access only if the device is marked as compliant. Okay, so it's fairly simple from an InTune perspective. Now, obviously, as a precursor to this, for this to work, the VMs, I say VMs, in my instance is VMs, if you've got devices, those devices have to be onboarded onto InTune, and they have to have these compliance policies on. So what I have here, by the way, for the purposes of testing, is I have another VM called this one, which is again joined to Azure AD, and it's a different user, Alex. If I log in as Alex, so this user, I've kept this user in a non-compliant state, and to check that, I'm just going to check the company portal, and you can see it's already saying, and this, by the way, has nothing to do with Checkpoint at the moment, right? This is pure between the VM or the device and your InTune policies. What happens basically is the device, once it's enrolled into InTune and you've created compliance policies and policies enforced on this, the token of whether a device is compliant and is allowed access is sent between Azure AD and the device. So at this point, if I try and connect to the VPN, it will try and connect, but obviously the token that it will get from Azure AD is device doesn't meet your organization's compliance requirement. So you can't have remote access VPN. So again, you can see really, really powerful if you have InTune or any sort of thing where you can create these compliance policies and let Azure and InTune dictate whether that client can have access to your corporate resources. So, and by the way, for this specific element that I've just shown you, in terms of the InTune stuff, there's no further configuration that needs doing on the gateway, and this is all InTune. All I've done is you need to make sure is you applied that, created that compliance policy, and more importantly, the conditional access policy. If I head to my demo compliance group, rather if I go to my users, and this is where this can be a bit slow sometimes. So if I click on that user and click on sign on logs, this you can see it's not populating. This will populate in a couple of minutes. If I change that to say last 7 days, I might have one from yesterday. There you go, this one here, and you can see it's failed because it's not in a required state and it's failed compliant policy. Okay, so that's how you can do compliance-based policy using InTune and using single sign-on with Saml. Any questions on that?
Nope, they're all quiet.
Okay. Okay, cool. So with that, I think I will close these. Don't think I need that. Need to make sure that's ready. So the last thing I want to go through is disaster recovery for CloudGuard in Azure. And due to the time restrictions and stuff, I'm only going to be able to cover Azure for the moment. I'm not going to be able to cover other clouds, but if you have checkpoint deployments in other clouds, please reach out and we can do this for those cloud environments as well. The reason this is important to highlight is that the approach that, or the method of performing disaster recovery that we've always had is different for CloudGuard deployments than to on-prem. You know, with on-prem, if an appliance died and we had to rebuild that appliance, our natural reaction would be to reach out to, when we're building the appliance, to reach out to the previous backup or the snapshot file to restore from. That isn't the case with CloudGuard deployment in Azure, or for that matter, any cloud. And that's down to the intricacies of software-defined networking and the automation side of cloud. You know, if you think about it, for a cluster member, if you have a cluster in Azure, a cluster member to release its VIP to the standby member, it still needs to make an API call. So it's not just VMs. The official process is from Checkpoint is to perform a parallel deployment and cutover of services. And that goes for whether that's a management server, whether that's a single gateway, or a HA cluster. And when I say HA cluster, even if it's one of the members that's died within the HA cluster, it's still, you need to do a parallel deployment of that cluster and cut over the services. It's a lot simpler than and less work than it sounds, provided you know beforehand why you need to do what you need to do, you understand the why, and you have documented the process of what you need to do when that time comes. It also ensures that the Azure API and IAM issues are minimized, because I briefly mentioned earlier where you have, you know, cluster members need to call API to do things with the external IP addresses. You need cluster members, for example, or for that matter, any element to be able to access certain resources, whether that's IP addresses, disks, everything's a resource within that resource group, and you need permissions. So by following this process, you minimize any issues that might arise with the API and the IAM side. Typical recovery time is under 60 minutes. And like I said, you know, the key point here is, provided you know why you need to do what I'm about to explain and you have a documented process, this shouldn't be that difficult. Okay, so I'll start with management server. So the prerequisite here with management server is to have the migrate export of the management server. And this is no different to on-prem, right? Even with on-prem, we used to say, yes, you should have scheduled backups, but always make sure that you have some form of migrate export of your management server off box, because the benefit of that is you're not shackled to any specific jumbo hotfixes or specific build types if you're relying on backups. Whereas with migrate export, you can literally take a migrate export from an on-prem and deploy it in AWS or in Azure or in another VM. So it's no different. You just need to make sure that you're using something like a cron job to export regularly your management server's migrate export configuration and moving it off box. Okay, that's the main prerequisite. In terms of the actual procedure, there's two processes or two different options to redeploy a management server. The first is to delete the old management server before deploying the new one. This way, it is likely to get the same IP address. And to be honest, if the management server's died and if you have a working migrate export, then the risk is minimal, right? But for those who are a bit risk averse, there's an alternative procedure as well, which I'll talk about after this one, where you don't have to delete the management server. But the reason we suggest deleting the management server is that when you deploy the new management server, it automatically comes up with the same IP address as the old internal IP address. And by the way, when I say delete the old management server, just delete the VM, not the associated IP addresses and all of that stuff. What you then do is you deploy a new management server from the marketplace. You make sure you give it the same resource name, make sure you put in the same VNet and the same subnet. At this point, it should get the old private IP, but obviously it will get a new public IP, and that's fine. And it will obviously go into the new resource group because we can't put new VMs into existing resource groups. But by the end of these three steps, you will have a blank management server with the same old IP address, but the new public IP. At this point, shut down the new management server and disassociate the new public IP from that management server, right? Because we don't want to use the new public IP in case you are managing other gateways externally, not through the VPN, through the old public IP address. Disassociate the old public IP from the old management server, and then associate it with the new management server. Okay. Start the new management server, and then copy your import configuration file onto the management server and import that file. And at that point, you will have a working functional management server with the same old internal IP address, same old public IP address. So you'll be able to manage your external gateways without any problems, and all of your licensing will also be fine because it's tied back to the same old private IP address, which is where you would normally do the central licensing for. The alternative, this is the one where we don't delete the management server, is you shut down the old management server. We deploy the new management server from Marketplace. As usual, give it the same resource name, make sure it goes into the same VNet. Obviously, because the old management server still exists, this one will get a new private IP and obviously new public IP address. And obviously we'll go to the new resource group. Shut down the new management server and disassociate the new public IP from that VM. Disassociate the old public IP from the old management server and associate it with the new management server. So at this point, you have the new management server with the the old public IP address. And then you change the private IP on the old management server to be completely random, right? Just pick one that's available free, but just a random IP address. And at that point, that frees up the old private IP. So you can set the new management server to have that old private IP address. Start the management server, import the migration configuration, and at that point, you will have exactly the same VM, old IP address, old public IP, and your configuration imported. And once you're happy, at that point, you can delete the old management server, right? So 2 procedures, but like I said, as long as you are familiar with it. Sorry?
It's all right. Somebody who's joined's not on mute. Let me just mute them.
Fine, thank you.
There we go.
That's 2 different processes. Like I said, one where you delete the old management server, but you understand why, because we're effectively wanting to release the old private IP for when you create the new VM. In reality, it doesn't really matter. You can follow this process and you can still have the old management server there as long as you remember to change the private IP addressing so that your licensing remains in situ. Moving on is the HA cluster. Now, the prerequisites for HA cluster is that, amongst a few things, first and foremost is to make sure that you have a copy of the Gaia OS level configuration. But particularly what I'm looking for is things like routing configuration, admin users, DNS NTP, not interface information, because that's a bit tied to that specific VM. We don't want that information. And to be honest, all of that's configured anyway when you go through the deployment of our cluster. So assuming one of your cluster members is still functional, you can access that and you can copy that information through doing show configuration. Like I said here, and what you can do is either you can, at this point, there's 2 things you can do. You can either bring that information into Notepad, extract the bits that you need, so routing, admin users, DNS NTP, paste that information into a text file, and when you're deploying the cluster through Azure, there will be a field in there which it will ask you, do you want to provide a bootstrap file? All that bootstrap file is a text file where you can provide certain configuration information, which Azure will take that, and when it's deploying your cluster, it will pre-populate that cluster with that information that you provide. You don't have to do that. You can do that later on. But the key point is make sure you think about any changes that you've made to that cluster post deployment. And if you have, make sure you've taken a backup of that using show configuration on the Gaia. So the actual procedure when it comes to deploying cluster. You deploy a new cluster from Marketplace. Make sure you put it into the same VNet and the subnet. It will obviously get a new private and new public IP. It will obviously go into a new resource group. Either add that routing admin DNS stuff after your first time visit, or you import it in as part of the bootstrap file. You must update the Azure Iam stuff, okay? And by this, what I mean, I think that best if I show you this, is if you, sorry, let me move this so I can see. So if you go to your Azure resource group, now in this instance, I have all of my public IP addresses, my load balancer, everything is in the same resource group, okay? All I need to do is go within the access control, the IAM section of that resource group, role assignments, and make sure that the new cluster members that I've deployed, I give them the same contributor role within this resource group where the old public IP, the old load balancer, everything that we need to use resides. If, for example, you're one of those customers where you've got public IPs in a different resource group, your VNets are in a different resource group, you'll need to go to each individual section and make sure that you've given those cluster members, the new cluster members, contributor role to those specific sections, okay? Once you've done that, once you've done that, you then need to configure the new cluster members to reference the old cluster VIP, okay? This is important specifically if you are terminating VPNs on that cluster, if you're hiding traffic behind that specific old cluster VIP. If you've got no need to have the same cluster VIP, for example, because you're not using it, or you're not tied down to that, you don't have to do that. But the likelihood is that you are relying on that old cluster VIP. So to do that, what you need to do is on each of your cluster members, you need to, I've done this before, so you guys can see this, is take a backup of this file on each of the cluster members. There's a azure-ha.json file, and then edit that file. And within the section where it says cluster network interface, in here, we need to add an additional line for the resource ID of the old cluster VIP. So what we do is we find, so if I go here, go back to my resource group, sort by type. There's my cluster VIP, right? This is the one of my old cluster members VIP. If I click on that, I could do show JSON. There's a couple of ways. This is the quickest. That bit there, you copy that. That's the resource ID for that cluster VIP. You paste that in, literally, it could be after that line, right? That's all you need to do. And you do that on both the cluster members. Once you've done that, you need to run a script called azure_ha_cli.py Python script and a reconf. I'll put this into the slide decks, which I sent out to you later on. And you do that on both the cluster members. And at that point, the cluster members will be aware of the cluster VIP. It will be configured within their Python scripts. And the fact that we've done the updated the Azure Iam, they will have permissions to be able to access those resources. Reboot both cluster members, so it comes up clean with referencing that VIP. Go into your Smart Console, update the Smart Console with the new private IP addresses. and new public IPs if it's managed externally. The private and the public IPs we don't really need to change, because these are used for managing the gateways, not necessarily terminating VPNs or hiding traffic. So we're not bothered the fact that those IP addresses have changed. We then need to delete the old, delete the new load balancers, okay? Because we don't need the new load balancers. We will carry on using the old load balancers for the purposes of this cluster. We will also need to delete the new front-end load balancers public IP, because again, we don't need that. We'll carry on using the old public IP. And on the old load balancers, we need to make sure that they now reference the new cluster members. So to do that, it's fairly simple. You find the old load balancers, so both front end and load back end. So what I'm about to show you, you do this on exactly the same, follow the exact same steps on both. So you can see here, these are my old cluster members. All I'll do is I'll remove them from the pool, which is delete here on the right, and then add the new cluster members to this pool. And you need to do this for both the front end load balancers and the back end load balancers. Okay. So do that, install a policy. So the gateway actually has a policy at this point. And at that point, after that, you disassociate the old cluster bit from the old cluster member, and you reboot the new cluster members in turn again, just to make sure they can come up clean. And just test failover of the new cluster. There's also one thing you can do once you've done all of this stuff to make sure everything's working is, again, I'll put this in the slide which we send out, is another Python script, which is Azure HA test, and it will run the tests in terms of permissions, API calls, and it will tell you whether everything's perfectly fine. Okay, so that's Azure, HA cluster disaster recovery for the cluster members. Dave, I'm conscious of time. This shouldn't take long, another 5 minutes.
That's all right. Don't worry. You know me, I can be flexible. I can talk slower or faster, so it's all good.
Perfect. So the last bit is similar stuff for single gateway. Now, the thing with single gateways is this is really kind of a change, or say an adaptation of what we did with the Azure, the HA cluster disaster recovery. Again, we need a copy of the Gaia OS level configuration. The key point to remember here with the cluster, where if one of your members died, we might have another cluster member to log on to. If it's a single gateway, if that gateway's died, we won't be able to extract this information. So please make sure that you have copied this prior in terms of, as a best practice, what we tend to say is as soon as you deploy a cluster or a gateway or a management server, and you're happy with how everything's functioning, go to the Gaia OS level and do a short configuration and take a copy of that. But also get into a habit of doing that same thing when you make a Gaia level change on any of those devices. Obviously, like I said, you will need this before the failure occurs. Again, same logic. So you can either configure the routing, admin, DNS, NTP stuff post doing the initial configuration, or you copy that into a bootstrap file and you import that as part of the deployment. Some customers do have single gateways with the front-end load balancer, because they might have multiple public IP addresses that are doing static NATs to web servers on that single gateway. They might have, to be honest, we've got certain customers who've got more than one public IP address attached to their external interface of the single gateways. So it is a bit difficult to be a bit more prescriptive with the single gateway disaster recovery, but the blocks are effectively the same. But again, if you have a single gateway in Azure and you want to think about or planning how you go about doing disaster recovery, and if this what I'm giving you here is not sufficient enough, please reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to help you document this. So the actual procedure, deploy a new gateway for Marketplace. Again, same as before, it will get a new private IP and new public IP. It will go into a new resource group, add the routing admin DNS either manually or through the bootstrap script, update Azure Iam in the same way that I showed around the cluster VIP, Here, what we are referencing is the external IP address, that kind of stuff. So make sure, and VNet. So make sure you go to, again, the same resource level group and assign the contributor role to that gateway. And then configure the new gateway to reference the old gateway's IP address. So you would find the gateway in this instance, the IP address, and you would change it where it says configuration. You would change it to be assigned to not that gateway. Sorry, I'm trying to find, probably looking in the wrong place now. Actually, I know. So you find it, do it through the interface. So if I go to the interface and IP configuration, you here have reference to that specific member IP. This is where you would disassociate and you would go to the new gateway and associate it with that specific IP. Updates the gateway object in Smart Console with new private IP addresses. And if you've got new public IP managed externally, change that as well. Again, if you're using a front-end load balancer, which we know some customers do, then do exactly what I showed with the cluster, which is go in and remove references to the old gateway and associate the new gateway into that pool. And finally, install a security policy. And if you have any UDRs that you've created because you have more than one subnet behind the firewall, then update those UDRs to point the new backend private IP address of the gateway. And that's it. So that's done. So like I said, just to recap on that, checkpoint supporting procedure, bear in mind, is parallel deployment and cutover of services. Gaia backups, Gaia snapshots, and even Azure backup services are not supported in terms of disaster recovery when it comes to Checkpoint Cloud Guard in Azure. So just bear that in mind. And like I said, if you guys need help creating a kind of an ICE document, which we have done for quite a few of our customers, to detail this for their specific environment, factor in the changes and the intricacies of their specific deployment, we can more than happily help you with that. And I think with that, that's me done, Mr. Rawl.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Or...
No, they've been quiet for the last half an hour, unless my chat window is broken, which I don't think it is. I think it's all working okay. They've been surprisingly quiet. Cool. So yeah, all good. Thank you for that. And I hope everybody appreciates the amount of detail and effort you've gone into on that, because it is pretty phenomenal to see it all laid out like that. So I've said it to you in privately a million times, but publicly, thank you very much for the effort that goes into that. I know it, having done it myself over the years, I know it isn't easy. So thank you, mate. I am going to, I've got 15 minutes, which is probably about right, to be honest. I'm just going to quickly go through, if I can steal the screen sharing. Yeah. By the way, that slide that Jay had up is just a summary of some SKs, which you'll obviously all have access to when we send this deck out to everyone. So let me just stick a window up. Hopefully this is going to work, and hopefully everybody can see that. Confirm or deny anyone? Jay, can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah, cool, thank you. So I'm just going to do a quick run through of Checkpoint's Maestro solution now, just before we get our managed service provider Security HQ to do a run through of their services and what they can provide to our customers. Maestro is a very, very interesting piece of technology. It's been around, I'm going to say, was announced at CPX 3 years ago originally, and it was an evolution of the old Checkpoint chassis-based product. But it is now a lot more than that. And I think for Jay and myself, we get to a point where a product goes from being a niche, if you like, to something that we think is worth bringing to the broader customer database. And Maestro has certainly crossed that line now. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the stuff that's going on with it. I'm also going to just try and explain what it is and why we think it's important. And the first thing I think to say about Maestro is that for almost all, if not all, of Checkpoint's competition in the next-gen firewall space and the advanced security space, more throughput on site means bigger boxes. Okay, and Checkpoint are still heavily investing in their on-premise technology as well as in their cloud technology. And Maestro is effectively RAID for firewalls. And when I say RAID, I mean, multiple hard drives in a server or multiple SSDs in a server, providing redundancy striped across those devices. If one of the devices fails, obviously that server continues to function. Maestro is effectively the same for firewalls, but it scales, and it can scale up to 50+ firewalls, providing terabits of throughput. And really, we've had some big changes this year with Maestro. And the most important to say is that it is now running the R81.10 code, which is the same production code that the main firewall train is on. So it's on what we call main train. It's fully merged. And because of that, the jumbo hotfixes that are released for Checkpoint firewalls are applied to Maestro simultaneously as they are to normal firewalls. The code is actually, the Maestro code is called Scalable Platforms, so SP is the code name for it. And I'll go through the terminology and how it all works a little bit, but basically with the autoclane technology that's available in Maestro, you can take a brand new firewall out of the box, you can plug it into the Maestro cluster, and it will be online providing capacity in less than 6 minutes, which is phenomenal. And now there are obviously, with all things, certain caveats around that, and I'll talk about those in a sec. But basically, brand new box, brand new firewall piece of hardware delivered out of the cardboard box, put it in the rack, cable it up, turn it on, online within 6 minutes, which is pretty phenomenal. So a little bit of terminology for you first when it comes to Maestro. The brains of the outfit is the orchestrator or the hyperscale orchestrator. That, you'll see a picture of the front of a couple of them in a minute, is effectively, I'll call it the switch, but it's the switch and the brain, and decides where the traffic goes, etc. SMO stands for the single management object. The single management object is, if you've got 5 disks in RAID 5, it presents as a single volume in the device. That's the SMO. Effectively, that's what a single management object is. And the security policy configuration, software versions, and hotfixes, and routing information are all shared between the firewalls that constitute an SMO. And the last piece of terminology is the security gateway module, or SGM. That is a physical individual box. So that's what the SGM is. That's roughly how Maestro gets hooked up and how it all gets connected. So you have your management links, which are the red ones. That's how you actually talk to the orchestrator. You then have your, for want of a better description, firewall interfaces. So if you had a normal on-premise firewall, you would obviously have your internet link, you'd have your internal links, you might have them on bonds, you might have them on physicals, you might have lots of different VLANs, but the blue section on these boxes is your internal firewall links, effectively, but they all plug into the orchestrator. They do not plug into the firewalls. The firewalls plug into the green area on these boxes, okay? And the green area, either be a 10 gig link or a 40 gig link or a 100 gig link, whatever it is, basically the firewall has a single connection back to the orchestrator, or if you have 2 orchestrators, it has a connection back to each orchestrator. So it's really, really simple from a point of view of understanding. Your links out to your network go into the blue section of the orchestrator. You connect to the orchestrator to manage it, and the management traffic flows down there. And then the green links are where your firewalls go to. Very, very simple to cable up and get working when you get your head around it. Please do, Jay, if you could do me the favor of watching for any questions that chip in on this one, we'll swap roles for this. So please do ask any questions as we go if you need any, if you've got any. Key points with Maestro. So although, I mean, a few of you throughout the question said, well, should we be on R81? Should we be on R81.10? Where should we be? Checkpoint's own engineers and own scalable platform specialists recommend 81.10. The reason for that is that in 81.10, the code is amalgamated and there is only one set of jumbos for non-scalable and scalable boxes. So they recommend you are on 81.10. That being said, if you are in an 81 environment, R81 Jumbo 34 and above introduces pretty much feature parity between 81.10 and 81, but then new features might get added into 81.10 that don't get added in a Jumbo in 81. So we do recommend that you're on 81.10 if you're looking at Maestro. So your management console would need upgrading if you're not already on that version. And if you are building a Maestro cluster or rebuilding a Maestro cluster, make sure you're using the right version of the ISO. It's the only thing really that's different, and it's a shared ISO between the orchestrators and the gateways now. You just download the scalable platform ISO and you use it. It literally just gets thrown into place. So you can see it there. I've kind of highlighted it in yellow. That's the one that you would put in. Why would you ever download one? Well, in theory, if you've got gateways that are being used, they might, if you've bought them to be used as a scalable platform, if you get a replacement shipped, it should be shipped with the scalable platform image, although it might not be. But when I come on to talking about things like mix and match and things like that and redeploying old gateways, you would need to re-image these yourselves. So you need to make sure you pick the right one. So just really emphasizing that point, because it goes wrong if you don't. Recent fixes to old problems. So when we first started talking to customers about Maestro, this set of things here on this screen were one of the biggest reasons that that customers weren't prepared to look at it, because a lot of customers have VPNs to private cloud, as in Azure, AWS, things like that. And a lot of the things that are on this list are required for AWS and Azure, and VPN connectivity to AWS and Azure. So we actually found it, most customers, we were tripping over problems with Maestro. This is now fixed. All of these issues that were kind of yes, but issues when we were having Maestro conversations with customers pre and through the pandemic are now cured, as you can see for this. So this is when I said R81 Take 34 brings feature parity with R81.10. It's basically these things that bring that feature parity together. So you can see here. Now, I'm not going to read through the list, but you'll get the slide deck afterwards, and I've put the SK numbers that have the detail in on any of these. But these were some of the main things that were holding people back from adopting Maestro. It's now solved and up and running in 81.10. And the latest Jumbo. There is a detailed FAQ document. If you are so inclined, you can go and read it. That just gives you, obviously, each one of those little red lines clicks out. I don't expect to be able to read it, but there's the SK number. If you want to go and read the FAQ and get a feel for what is and isn't supported, go and have a look. That is a long and detailed list of everything you could possibly need to know about Maestro and how it all pulls together. Mix and match. So this is where it starts to get really interesting, because one of the things you can do with RAIDing hard drives is, not that you ever should technically, but certainly on certain things like NAS setups, you can mix and match drives to get hybrid RAID. And that's what mix and match does with Maestro. Now, I've only included the 6000 series appliances here, but every series of appliances from the 5000s up has a matrix in this SK number. And the SK again included there. But what you can do, as you can see, is you can take a 6200 and you can mix it with a 6600, or you can take a 6600 and you can mix it, he says, talking about it. No, you can take a 68 and you can mix it with a 7000. The yellow exclamation marks are Checkpoint's way of saying, we think this will work, but we haven't tested it and we haven't got time. So give it a go. Your mileage may vary. But what this means is, if you do have different versions of appliances, or if you've got, you know, a 62 and you realize that you're going to go for Maestro and you want to buy 66s, you can incorporate your 62 into that cluster and into that availability group. So this is a really useful functionality. Now, on the quiet, pretty much any piece of hardware that supports Maestro can be pretty much mixed with any piece of hardware that supports Maestro. However, it isn't necessarily recommended because of the potential for bottlenecking and things like that. But and then there's the difference between supported versus unsupported. But this is something we can play with, and obviously we can test with customers. So any appliance really from the mid to high 5000 series onwards drop into these matrices, and in this SK number there are matrix for them. The only thing that doesn't work with mix and match is auto clone. If you've got two 6800s, two 6600s rather, and everything's working, if you plug another 66 in, obviously it will auto clone the config across. If you plug a 62 in, it will not. You will have to prep it and build it manually in terms of operating system, jumbos, all that kind of stuff. It will pick up IPs and routes, but it will not pick up the underlying operating system and patches. And it's worth saying with autoclone, one of the things that's great about it is if you're applying jumbos, you know, if you've got 8 boxes in a group in Maestro, you only have to jumbo once and it will then pick it up on all the boxes. Feature parity, this is really talking about R81.10, but just to give you an idea of what's going. Quaz is now available in Maestro. It wasn't before. VMAC mode, which is something those of you who delved into Cluster XL, making the boxes share a VMAC rather than having their own, is now available in Maestro. That's quite important, and I'll come on to that in a minute for people that might have switch issues. ISP redundancy is available. It could be argued that if you've got an all singing, all dancing Maestro environment, you've probably got BGP configured at your internet front end, OSPF in place, and all the rest of it. But if you are using ISP redundancy for any reason, it's now available. One thing in 81.10 is you do a non-stateful failover on an upgrade. When you're moving between boxes from 81.20 onwards, it will be fully seamless. The new quantum lightspeed NICs will be fully supported in 81.20, and dynamic balancing of the security groups is available for 81.20. But the key point here for me is that these boxes are, now that they're into the main train code, being very aggressively developed. I think it's fair to say when they first launched, they launched on the 80.20 code, and they had their own version of code. And Checkpoint really concentrated on reliability rather than new features at that time. Whereas now they are getting new features at the same time that the rest of the code train is getting new features. And some of the obvious stuff that you would think just is in there is now appearing. So it's really good to see that these boxes are, and it goes back to this ready for mainstream statement, that they are now getting features at the same pace as everything else. Gotchas: switch compatibility, switch compatibility, and switch compatibility. Okay. You don't just throw Maestros into your network. We need to look at the switches, and we need to look at how things work. Because of the way they work, Maestro boxes do embed packets into packets that then get unpacked further down. Because of that, jumbo frame support is essential. If you don't get jumbo frame support, you get packet fragmentation of some of the core management traffic, and that can cause massive problems on the network. It doesn't add a lot, but it adds enough for standard size packets to get cut up and for things to get very, very confused. And the way Maestro works is it's just say the phrase MAC address agile. And if your switches do not like that, it can cause problems as well. Hence why the VMAC modes and the same VMAC stuff from the previous slide is so important. But we do need to do, and quite often get Checkpoint involved because they've got broader experience of us of different switch infrastructures. You do need to get us involved to look at this. If you buy them and try and configure them yourselves, you're likely to be banging your head against a brick wall for a long period of time, not because of anything to do with the technology itself, but because of the way your infrastructure is interacting with it. And no copper here. Okay, we are on 10 gig DAC straight into the firewalls. That's how they are configured. If you want to start doing anything like that, then we're into transceivers and things like that and unsupported. So we are expecting direct DAC connections and things like that for this to work. And we normally would use bonds. And we can go all the way up to 100 gig. 40 is very common, and it's very common for people to use 40s with like pigtails that split the 40s out to 410s to give them some real port density as well. Some other key points: is it the replacement for VSX? VSX is Checkpoint's existing or long-standing virtual firewall technology, where you take a single piece of hardware and can cut up virtual firewalls on it. Well, with Maestro, we can also take the orchestrator, add boxes to it, and have multiple virtual firewalls. They're not virtual, they're real, made up of multiple firewalls, but we can have multiple of them. We're now starting to see functionality taken out of VSX and put into Maestro. This is not Checkpoint's words, but this is mine. It might well be the replacement for VSX going forward. An example of this is with VSX, what you could do is you could have a box at your primary site, a box at your secondary site. And if you had two firewalls running on, say you had Firewall A and Firewall B at the primary site, Firewall A could be the primary for that site, Firewall B could be the backup. And then on the other site, you also have Firewall A and B, but B would be the primary and A would be the backup. So you could run active-active with failover between the sites. That functionality is now removed from VSX. You will need Maestro if you wish to retain that functionality within Checkpoint going forward. There you go, and I'm almost there. Closing points. So we're very excited about the changes Checkpoint have made over the last 6 months with Maestro. It is a great piece of technology, and it really allows massive scale, and with mix and match flexibility. You can throw multiple hardware on it, and if you want to add boxes, and say you've got some older boxes and you want to add newer boxes, and maybe Checkpoint have just done a new release and there's a new shiny box, an 8000 or something like that, you'd be able to add those in. And because of that, you've got the flexible upgrades of hardware and scalability. it's integrated into main train. There's nothing quirky about it anymore. And those new features and fixes are being added as a result of that. And that was a very hurried introduction to Maestro. I say very hurried, I think it took me about 15 minutes. So without further ado, I'm going to check that our colleagues from Security HQ are online and hand over the screen sharing to them. Guys, are you there?
Yes, hi David. Afternoon, everyone.
Hi, Islam.
Yeah, I'm
right,
here.
so I'm going to stop screen sharing. There we go.
Perfect. So let me share my screen. Just a second, please.
How are we doing?
Yep.
There we go. Okay, yep, we can all see that. I'll mute out. I'll field any questions for you at the end, Islam.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Just a second. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
There we go.
Right, perfect. Thank you very much, David, and everyone for your time and staying with us up to now. My name is Islam Rashal. I work as a managed cybersecurity solutions consultant with Security HQ, which is the exclusive MSSP provider for Bytes, supporting Bytes with all of their customer managed cybersecurity needs across the UK and Ireland. And we have been doing this for the last 7 years. In providing and collaborating together and providing managed cybersecurity services across the board, including obviously managing checkpoint security technologies in terms of firewalls and endpoint security, sandblast, and so on. So yeah, a pleasure to be with you today and give you a quick walkthrough who we are at Security HQ and how we can support you in managing your checkpoint firewalls in the 24/7 format. What we can do to help you with such endeavor as well from our side. In terms of who we are as Security HQ, we are a global MSSP provider. We have been in the market for the last 14 years with the exclusive partnership with Bytes in delivering the MSSP services since 7 years ago, actually since almost 2014. We securely actually provision our services in a 24/7 format through different shift squads across 6 global SOC centers, primary SOC center located in London, Canary Wharf, 10 minutes walk from the Jubilee Line Station, Tier 3 certified and ISO certified SOC center. And then we do have other SOC centers scattered across the globe to support our 24/7 operations and based out of Dubai, Qatar, and Saudi, global SOC center in Pune in India, Australia, and recently we just opened our newest SOC center in the US, in New York, to support our operations and customer requirements across the Americas region. So constantly expanding our global footprint, adding to our accumulated years of experience within the MSSP space in providing more than 10 different managed security services, obviously including the managed firewall and checkpoint security as one of the core services. We do have more than 265 security analysts, fully trained, equipped and skilled and certified in delivering the wide range of security services. We do have a dedicated team for managing the checkpoint, endpoint and firewalls as well, certified, holding all of the required accreditations. Some real life pictures of our SOC centers are properly built with full physical resiliency to ensure that we deliver you to the required service uninterrupted 24/7 across the entire year. Perfect. So let me dive a little bit more into the challenge that we are facing nowadays. I would say has started actually years ago and recently was more accelerated due to the unexpected arrival of the pandemic, where we had to shift more into more agile mode and shift from the traditional kind of perimeter type of security into enabling more of workforce transformation, enabling our users and employees to work from anywhere, and enabling all of the required mobility tools in place. Obviously came with a huge price in terms of digital risk exposure and the security implications of how we can mitigate the threats of being exposed to a very expanded, constantly evolving threat landscape We're not talking just about our perimeter security, or talking about the cloud risks working from public networks offer little to no security. We cannot just rely on the user awareness. We have to do much more than this, and how we can secure the new notion of the user perimeter, not just relying on the corporate traditional type of security. So we need to look into, when we look into firewalls and how we test, we need to establish the required level of security, layered levels of security, focusing first, obviously, on the first line of defense. We need to look into, obviously, keeping the threat actors out. A lot of hostility coming from the outbound, from the internet, how we can ensure that we are locking down our front door in the best possible way by having the advocate firewall access policies in place, in having the IPS modules enabled to block all the required attacks in an automated fashion based on the known signatures and known IOCs and indicators of compromise, content security and email and web gateway in terms of URL filtering, and having an advocate email protection in place as well, to make sure that we try to filter as much as possible any phishing emails or emails having any malicious drive-by compromise links embedded into them, which is obviously a very common known attack vector widely employed by the threat actors. And now we need to focus into, we need to shift into the new security requirements as a result of the constant digitization, employing the digital transformation in place, workforce transformation, working from anywhere with all of the implications of it. Now we need to look into how we can secure more of our users. The source of the compromise most of the time happening with the endpoints. So it's all about the user identity, the endpoint machine, the end-user transactions within your internal corporate, and how they are behaving and interacting with the different internal applications, whether cloud-based or on-prem hosted. So we need to look into more of a policy and identity trusted type of access. We need to make sure that we have the assume the compromised approach, the zero trust implications or strategy in terms of trust but always verify. It's no longer just trust with no verify. We have to always have different levels of user in identity validation and verification in place, least privilege as well, always implemented, and just-in-time access and all of that sort of stuff. And being able to monitor the end-user activities at the kernel level, having an ability to record all of the different activities happening on the endpoint machine associated with the user, different users incorporating with that or using that endpoint machine. So having secure mobility always on, obviously, relying on SSL, VPNs, and VDIs, and IPsec tunnels, and all of that sort of stuff to enable the teleworkers to perform all of the required job duties. Cloud security as well in place in terms of accessing the SaaS-based applications, and how we can have a granular level of access implemented in place to govern that type of access and have a visibility on what's happening with that type of access, really, which is often gets ignored or hard to monitor, mostly called or noted as the unsanctioned type of access, or like accessing Dropbox or Google Drive or anything like that, that can easily be used to exfiltrate data and bypass your traditional security controls in place. So all of these challenges obviously bring us into the need for having an evolved defense capabilities and threat detection capabilities that obviously Check Point, as we've seen so far, they have invented a lot of technologies that would tackle all of such challenges, like Harmony, the unified security access, enabling all of the required security controls at the user perimeter, if you will, to shield it and protect it in the best possible way. Sandblast to monitor the endpoint activities and provide heuristic-based and behavioral-based analytics, not just relying on the known malwares and IOCs. We need to look into the living of the land type of attacks as well, happening on potentially could happen on the endpoint machine. So it's all about elevating that level of your security posture, starting from the user perimeter rather than just focusing on your traditional perimeter security or edge security. So obviously, the technology on its own, it's brilliant, fantastic. It provides all of the required degree of visibility and a multitude of threat detection mechanisms. But you need to be always having the ability to capitalize on this investment and how you can constantly get the value out of it 24/7 format. In some in most cases, obviously with this influx of new cyber attacks and constantly evolving threat landscape and dynamic business requirements with the challenges of COVID and how we need to keep the businesses agile and being able to overcome such challenges of COVID. So we need to have the 24/7 in place, monitoring, constant optimization, looking into your security posture, and being able to manage such technologies that you invested in them throughout the whole actually year, not just within the normal business hours. And again, cyber doesn't sleep, so we need to make sure that we have the proper skilled security analysts available on demand to provide you with all of the required performance monitoring, operational monitoring, and security monitoring as well, and being able to respond to threats as they keep on happening, really. Also, the ability to support 24/7 from a change management, being able to execute emergency changes that will be needed as a result of a specific successful breach or a compromise within your network. So we need to implement the required countermeasures as quick as possible with proper expertise and understanding of the implications even of implementing such countermeasures, and making sure that they won't actually contribute to a much more severe impact on the business continuity, and having obviously the proper understanding of the technology and the different processes from a CAP perspective, and the risk assessments of any change that would be applied. So having at the end, obviously, the service wrapper of the Security HQ global MSSP expertise, being exposed 24/7 to a global and constantly evolving cyber attack surface, really. So again, that brings a lot of experience in how quick we need to respond and act into a various type of threat actors and nation state type of sponsored attacks, and obviously making sure that your arsenal in terms of the security tooling from Checkpoint are constantly being handled, maintained into the best possible level to give you the adequate level of protection and cyber defense in place. So from our side, and working obviously in conjunction with Bytes team, Spark team, we collaboratively work in providing you the required 24/7 requirements in terms of addressing the challenges of having the skilled staff in-house to manage the tooling at 24/7, being able to have the required expertise available on demand, instant response capabilities, monitoring from an operational perspective, any hardware performance issues, memory leakage issues, any kind of software issues or hiccups or anything like that, being able to respond to it as quick as possible. So bring you all of this value on top of your investment in having the tooling, and obviously being able to consolidate all of the findings across your hybrid environment, on-prem, virtually hosted, or cloud hosted, being able to consolidate and give you a single pane of glass view across the entirety of your state in terms of what's happening, and the instance that we managed to spot. And obviously throughout such journey of delivering that 24/7 MSSP service for you around your invested technologies, bring you the required discipline and making sure that you are constantly aligned with the required compliance needs in place. And obviously that will naturally, I would say, bring you to the level of having a more elevated level of security posture around your organization. So in terms of when we talk specifically around the firewalls, we have to talk about more, we have to dive more into the change management process due to its complexity in some cases based on the scope of the change needed, and also the implications of it. They have to be very well assessed, and making sure that we do have the rollback plans, adequate rollback plans in place, and mitigations if anything went wrong for any unforeseen reason, anything like that. So from our side, we do have the required, obviously, change management portal that you as a Bytes customer can always use and leverage to raise any kind of change request. We'll have the required SLAs in place that will govern how quick we need to respond to such, execute and respond to such changes. And obviously, based on the change request and the RFC that will be raised, we'll move into assessing its risk against your environment, what needs to be implemented in your firewall in terms of the policies we need to change and look into it, and obviously the design of the change based on your network environment topology, and then perform obviously and execute the change implementation. In terms of leveraging the CAP, we can leverage our own CAP process for this, or we can use your own CAM process if you are more comfortable in having us using it. And again, we act as a single unit in delivering the service and being a natural extension to your team. So at the end of the story, we need to make sure that we are delivering what you really need and are expecting out of the service in the best possible way. So we're very flexible in our approach. And then once we get the change implemented at the end, we need to keep monitoring it for at least 24 hours. Sometimes we actually extend the monitoring post the change implementation, just to make sure that there isn't any kind of negative impact coming out of that change over a certain period of time, and making sure business as usual was successfully implemented, and then we can obviously close the change accordingly. Moving forward, in terms of, all right, so we went through the different ways of how we can support you and how we can obviously implement the changes and the RFC process and CAP processes following the ITIL best practice. And now we need to give you the ability to interact with our team in a 24/7 format as well, make it very easy and convenient for you. So as part of our service, any service that you will subscribe to us with it through Bytes team, you will have a secure access into our security HQ portal, from which you can view the raised instance and changes and how we are handling them for you. Also, at the same time, we have a mobile app called Security HQ Response, in which you can download it through any mobile app store, and again gives you the same level of interaction and accessibility needed with our SOC team in 24/7 format. We're not really expecting you to be having your laptop all the time, so, and hence we're trying to make it very convenient and friendly as well, and how you can communicate with our SOC team and view how we are handling the detected threats out of your environment. At the end of the story, our aim here is to consolidate all of the different technologies and services and interaction points as well. In some cases, between us and Spark, any other third-party supplier within your network or organization, being able to consolidate all of this to you through a dedicated service delivery manager and the security HQ portal and mobile app as well. And again, giving you a RESTful API interface in which you can pull in required data as well if you have your own third-party ITSM tooling like ServiceNow or Remedy. I'm almost going to wrap up now by going through some use case studies from the field from our SOC based on the managed firewall observation findings for one of our existing customers. What we can detect for you and how quick we can detect it, and the implications of it. So, for instance, I will go through bypassing security controls. In some cases, we went, some changes will occur to bypass for a temporary period of time, some traffic for some contractor or some project taking place to allow certain HTTPS communication for a specific application, stuff like that. But in some cases, almost, often they get forgotten, something like that. So if you do have the service in place and obviously the RFC process in place, we'll be able to make sure that everything is getting rolled back as needed, making sure that we're not leaving any kind of cracks or vulnerable configuration or over permissive rules on the firewall itself. But that can lead to a potential breach. So let's say, for instance, detecting base 64 encoded URL communication, being able to spot this for you and alert you as well accordingly. Excessive URL access with IP addresses on different ports, some sort of reconnaissance and probing for any vulnerabilities taking place across different applications through the trusted and allowed traffic already, the HTTP and HTTPS. Excessive and repetitive URL blocks as well. We should be able to alert you as well and take the proper mitigation actions based on our observation, based on the threat intelligence that we will perform as well for such distributed denial of service attack or any kind of anomaly, traffic anomalies or abnormal communication. Excessive traffic on uncategorized web categories as well. We should be able to spot this for you and give you the proper guidance on how we can mitigate this and obviously implement the required changes. Repetitive connections to known malware C2 sites, attempts to bypass the proxy. We can detect it through excessive ports, 80 or 443 denies. the excessive port 53 denies, which equates to attempts to bypass DNS forwarders, right? So it's all about our capability to, once we spot a specific action that took place in the firewall, we should be able to map it to the relevant threat. What does it mean exactly from a cyber kill chain perspective? And based on this, we'll give you the guidance needed on how we can mitigate the spotted threat from our 24/7 SOC monitoring. And in some cases, obviously, we can implement an automated threat response actions using the, for instance, firewall, the checkpoint, sandblast for EDR, leveraging the EDR active security controls. Within our SOC, we do have SOAR technology powered by IBM Resilience, in which we can implement for you some playbooks and that will be able to reach out to different security controls within your environment to implement some certain countermeasures needed, not just against your checkpoint firewalls, but also we can reach out to different applications and systems like your database or other applications within your organization to make sure that we are containing any spotted breach in the most effective and quickest way as well. Most important thing, it's all about time, reducing the dwell time of any attacker within your environment by taking the appropriate and fast remediation actions. Also noticing any kind of beaconing activities that could actually, in some cases, indicate that there is some sort of a behavioral compromise that took place within the organization. So some sort of a highly evasive, highly tactical and evasive type of attack scenario took place and managed to gain foothold within the organization. Obviously, beaconing indicates that, so we need to obviously respond as quick as possible and take the countermeasures, not just against the firewalls, but even expand this as needed based on the blast radius, based on the scope of the attack, and expand this across your wider network. So bring you all of this expertise as part of the service, which obviously brings a lot of value and more kind of knowledge and awareness that obviously will augment your in-house capabilities in the best possible way. Again, just to put things in context for you, and I'm almost done with my presentation here. This just from our SOC. Again, we detected one of the bypass security controls type of threats on our firewall monitoring, in which we spotted some attempts to communicate with outbound malicious C2 domains at specific intervals. And then afterwards, from a timeline perspective, we noticed that there are other relevant activities happening to that type of beaconing or keep alive messages that took place, indicating that this is actually a successful compromise. Some compromised machines are communicating back with the C2 domains. So obviously we had to alert the customers team in place, the security team, on what's happening, and obviously alert them that we need to implement, enhance and optimize the configuration of their DNS architecture and get it amended, because actually it occurred due to bypassing DNS controls in place, and obviously leveraging, probably more than likely it was at this specific attack, it was a spear phishing one that was successful, unfortunately. So again, but through the monitoring 24/7 from the firewalls, we managed to spot the behavior, which indicated that there is a compromise taking place or already took place. And based on this, we need to implement the countermeasures as quick as possible, even not just related to the firewall, but even the DNS architecture itself, and making sure that we have the proper configuration in place in that regard. So at the end, from our side, we can deliver a multitude of values and benefits out of our 24/7 global SOC MSSP services in conjunction with Bytes, such as the compliance reporting, bringing you to the required compliance state by performing a full configuration and a policies audit on your firewalls using some of our SOC toolings like Firemon, in which we'll be able to review and perform a rationalization as well for all of the configured rules and enable modules, and provide you the reporting on your compliance state of your firewall configuration, being able, as I explained, to automate some of the threat containment actions as part of the wider incident response procedures needed, and obviously providing you with 24/7, not just from a security or operational monitoring, but also from, sorry, not just from security, but also from an operational perspective. Again, detecting any kind of software or hardware problems and being able to mediate them in the best possible way as quick as possible. Obviously, in having the support from Spark team for any kind of physical issues or RMAs needed, we can get them processed for you and get it replaced and perform all of the required health checks in place as well, constantly on a frequent basis, really. Being able to provide you the intelligence and visualization of the level of risk within your environment based on our SOC monitoring through the Security HQ portal and the mobile app as well, and the service reporting as well. And obviously, from a compliance perspective, again, being able to be compliant with ITIL, from having a full command and control over all of the required changes that will take place on your firewalls, accelerate the response and enforce the change process with the proper risk assessment procedure around it. The firewall optimization throughout our 24/7 monitoring, day in and day out, every week, we will be constantly looking into hardening and optimizing your configured, policies and rules and modules as well, and bringing a good logic against obviously your network topology in terms of the configured rules and making sure that they are fully aligned. And at the end, obviously, we would love to have the ability to show you the value of our service and give you a little bit of taste of how does it look like actually using by giving you a free firewall audit, in which we can look at your firewalls, your network topology, and inspect and assess all of the configured rules and policies, application aware or identity aware policies, all of them across the whole settings, and being able to produce at the end produce with a report in terms of our findings and the optimizations and actions needed and recommendations. And on that note, I would like to thank you very much for your time, and please feel free to ask any question. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Right, we haven't got any questions. We're getting a lot of thank you very much, everybody, and all that kind of stuff. So what we'll do, I think, is we said we're going to run to 1 o'clock. It's pretty much 1 o'clock. So I think we'll wrap up. Guys, thank you very much. Oh, that's the wrong camera. What's that done? Let's move that back to where it should be. There we go. Guys, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a long old session. It's difficult to run these virtually, but hopefully we'll see you face to face in the new year. Jay, again, thank you so much for all the work. Lots and lots of adulation coming in on the chat, which is fantastic. Please follow up with your account manager or any of our sales specialists if you do want any assistance or anything like that. Obviously, Jay briefs all of the consultants and the support guys on everything he's about to tell you. So that means that when one of you logs a ticket saying, so I watched an event and I want to configure compliance with InTune against my firewall, please, can you help me? They won't throw their toys too far out the pram, although they might refer you to our professional services team. Guys, we'll let you all go. Thank you very much for your attendance. Jay, thank you.